Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a new descent into fear with 8 of the most disturbing true rest stop horror stories ever shared. These accounts are not drawn from imagination or secondhand tales, but from the harrowing testimonies of individuals whose routine highway stops became encounters they wish they could forget. Each story transports us to the desolate corners of America's interstate system, where fluorescent lights flicker over empty parking lots and predators lurk in the shadows between vending machines and bathroom stalls. From late-night fuel emergencies turned deadly to family road trips interrupted by human monsters. These tales reveal the chilling truth that danger often waits where travelers feel most vulnerable. The testimonies have been carefully documented and cross-referenced to ensure their veracity remains uncompromised, while certain identifying details have been altered to protect the privacy of those brave enough to share their ordeals. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell, so you never miss a single night when the unknown comes calling. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own highway experiences or which story disturbed you the most. Driving for 14 straight hours had pushed me past my limit, and I knew that continuing would be dangerously irresponsible for both myself and other drivers on the highway. The digital clock on my dashboard read 1:47 a.m. as I searched desperately for somewhere safe to pull over and catch a few hours of sleep before completing the final stretch of my journey from Seattle to Denver. My name is Baylant, though most people have trouble pronouncing it correctly. And I was 26 years old when this incident occurred, working as an independent contractor hauling freight across the western United States in my modified pickup truck. The load I was carrying was not particularly valuable, just industrial equipment bound for a construction site in Colorado. But the delivery deadline was tight and the customer had emphasized the importance of arriving on schedule. I had been making good time until a massive traffic backup caused by a multi-vehicle accident near Boise had cost me nearly 3 hours, forcing me to push deeper into the night than I normally would have preferred. Fatigue was beginning to affect my reaction time and judgment, and I knew that finding a place to rest was no longer optional but absolutely essential. The truck stop I had planned to use was still 40 miles ahead according to my GPS, but my eyelids were growing heavy and I was starting to experience the telltale signs of micro-sleep that had ended the careers of too many long-haul drivers I had known over the years. When I spotted the exit sign for a rest area just 2 miles ahead, I decided to swallow my pride and settle for a few hours of uncomfortable sleep in my truck cab rather than risk falling asleep at the wheel and potentially killing someone. The rest area was larger than most, with separate parking sections for passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, along with a substantial brick building that housed restrooms, vending machines, and a small information center. There were perhaps a dozen other vehicles scattered throughout the lot when I arrived. Mostly long-haul truckers who had made the same decision I was making, choosing safety over comfort by sleeping in their cabs rather than pushing forward into dangerous territory. The commercial parking section was well lit by overhead sodium lights that cast everything in an orange glow, and I found a spot near the back where my truck would not block other drivers. I had developed a routine over my years of highway driving for these overnight stops, checking that all my doors were locked, adjusting my mirrors to provide maximum visibility around my vehicle, and positioning my phone and CB radio within easy reach in case I needed to call for help. My sleeping bag was stored behind the driver's seat along with a small pillow and a few personal items, and within 10 minutes of parking, I had transformed my cab into a reasonably comfortable sleeping space. But sleep did not come easily despite my exhaustion, perhaps because of the unfamiliar environment or the ambient noise from highway traffic that continued throughout the night. I dozed fitfully for what felt like an hour or two, waking periodically to check my surroundings and ensure that nothing had changed since I had closed my eyes. The other trucks in the lot remained dark and quiet, their drivers presumably getting the rest they needed before continuing their own journeys in the morning. It was during one of these periodic wake-up checks, probably around 3:30 a.m. based on the position of the moon, that I noticed the sedan parked about 50 yards away from my truck. The vehicle had not been there when I had arrived, and its occupants appeared to be awake and active despite the late hour. Two figures were visible in the front seats, and they seemed to be engaged in animated conversation while occasionally gesturing toward the various trucks in the commercial parking area. At first, I assumed they were simply travelers who had stopped to rest, perhaps discussing their route or arguing about whether to continue driving or wait until dawn. But as I watched through my side mirror, their behavior began to seem increasingly suspicious. They were not settling in for sleep like normal travelers would, but rather conducting what appeared to be a systematic survey of all the commercial vehicles in the lot, taking particular interest in the trucks that showed no signs of occupancy. One of the figures exited the sedan and began walking through the parking area, moving from truck to truck with purposeful determination. He carried a small flashlight that he used to examine license plates and peer through windows, clearly searching for something specific, though I could not determine what that might be. When he reached a large semi-trailer that had been parked near the restroom building, he spent several minutes working at the trailer doors with what appeared to be some kind of tool. I realized I was witnessing either a theft in progress or reconnaissance for a future crime, and I reached for my CB radio to contact other drivers in the area, or potentially reach a state trooper who might be monitoring the emergency channels. But before I could key the microphone, the figure near the semi-trailer looked directly toward my truck, and I had the distinct impression that he had spotted me watching him despite the distance and darkness. He immediately abandoned whatever he had been doing at the trailer and began walking toward my location with a stride that suggested hostile intentions rather than innocent curiosity. I quickly locked my doors and started my engine, preparing to leave the rest area if the situation escalated further. But the sound of my diesel engine turning over apparently alerted his companion in the sedan, because within seconds their vehicle was moving in my direction with headlights off and engine running unusually quiet. The two vehicles were now approaching my truck from different angles, clearly attempting to box me in and prevent my escape from the parking area. I realized that what I had initially interpreted as a simple theft operation was actually something far more dangerous, and that I had become a target because I had witnessed their activities. These were not opportunistic criminals looking for easy cargo to steal, but predators who were prepared to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. I threw my truck into reverse and backed away from my parking spot as quickly as possible, turning toward what I hoped would be a clear path to the exit. But the sedan had anticipated my movement and positioned itself to block the main route back to the highway, while the man on foot was now running toward me with something metallic glinting in his hand. I had to make a split-second decision between confronting them directly or finding an alternative escape route. The rest area was bordered on three sides by dense forest, but I remembered seeing a maintenance road that led around behind the restroom building when I had first arrived. It was not designed for commercial traffic, but my pickup truck was smaller and more maneuverable than a full-size semi, and it might provide an escape route that the sedan could not follow. I turned toward the maintenance road and accelerated hard, bouncing over a concrete curb and onto the narrow gravel surface that wound between the trees. My headlights illuminated a tunnel of overhanging branches as I navigated the rough terrain, and I could hear the sedan attempting to follow behind me despite the obvious damage being inflicted on its low-clearance undercarriage. The maintenance road was clearly not intended for high-speed pursuit, with sharp turns and steep grades that favored my four-wheel drive vehicle over their streetcar. But they were persistent in their chase, and I could see their headlights in my mirrors as they struggled to keep pace through the challenging terrain. The road eventually led to a gate that provided access to the highway maintenance facility, and I was relieved to discover that it was not locked despite the late hour. I drove through the gate and onto a paved access road that connected to the interstate about half a mile from the rest area, effectively bypassing the trap that had been set for me in the main parking lot. The sedan was no longer visible in my mirrors, presumably having given up the chase when the terrain became too difficult for their vehicle to handle. I drove for another 20 miles before stopping at a well-lit truck stop where I immediately contacted the state police to report what I had witnessed and experienced. The dispatcher took my report seriously and promised to send units to investigate the rest area, though she warned me that the suspects had probably fled the scene by the time officers arrived. She also mentioned that there had been several similar incidents reported along that stretch of highway over the past month, involving commercial drivers who had been targeted by individuals who appeared to be conducting organized cargo theft operations. The investigation that followed revealed that the rest area had been used as a base of operations for a criminal organization that specialized in hijacking commercial vehicles and stealing their cargo. They had developed a sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable targets, using spotters to monitor rest areas and truck stops for drivers who appeared to be traveling alone and carrying valuable loads. When they found suitable targets, they would either steal the entire vehicle or force the driver to cooperate through threats of violence. Several drivers had reported being approached by individuals who claimed to have mechanical problems or who offered assistance with directions, only to find themselves surrounded by multiple attackers who demanded access to their cargo. In at least 2 cases, drivers who had resisted or attempted to flee had been seriously injured during the encounters, and one driver had been hospitalized with stab wounds after refusing to surrender his truck keys. The police eventually arrested 4 individuals in connection with the cargo theft ring, recovering stolen merchandise worth over $200,000 and several commercial vehicles that had been taken from rest areas throughout Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. The investigation revealed that they had been operating for nearly 2 years, using a network of spotters and communication equipment to coordinate their attacks and avoid law enforcement detection. That night taught me valuable lessons about the vulnerability of commercial drivers during mandatory rest periods, and the importance of choosing overnight stops carefully. I learned to avoid isolated rest areas whenever possible, preferring instead to use busy truck stops with security personnel and surveillance cameras. I also invested in better communication equipment and developed relationships with other drivers who could provide mutual support during overnight stops. The cargo theft ring had specifically targeted drivers who appeared to be sleeping alone in their vehicles, counting on isolation and surprise to overwhelm their victims before they could call for help or escape. They had studied the patterns of commercial traffic and identified rest areas that provided optimal conditions for their operations, including limited visibility from the highway and multiple escape routes through surrounding terrain. I continued working as an independent contractor for several more years after that incident, but I never again underestimated the dangers that could lurk in seemingly safe rest areas during the vulnerable hours of the night. The highway system that enables commerce and connects communities across vast distances can also provide cover for predators who understand how to exploit the isolation and fatigue that are inevitable parts of long-distance trucking. That rest area in Idaho looked peaceful and secure when I first arrived, but it had been carefully selected by criminals who understood that tired drivers would be easy targets for robbery and violence. I was fortunate to escape with my life and my cargo intact, but other drivers were not so lucky in their encounters with the same organization. All I wanted was a quick bite before getting back on the highway, something simple and familiar that would sustain me through the remaining 4 hours of driving back to college in Pennsylvania. I had been visiting my grandmother in Virginia for her 80th birthday celebration, and the weekend had been filled with family gatherings and elaborate meals that left me feeling overly full and slightly drowsy. But the drive home was taking longer than expected due to construction delays and heavy traffic, and by the time I reached the large travel plaza along Interstate 95, my stomach was growling with hunger, and my energy levels were dangerously low. May was the name my grandmother always called me, though everyone else knew me as Michelle. And at 21 years old, I was finishing my junior year studying communications at a small liberal arts college in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. This was one of my regular trips home to see family, a routine journey I had made dozens of times over the past 3 years without ever encountering anything more threatening than aggressive drivers and occasional mechanical problems. But something felt different about this particular travel plaza from the moment I parked my Honda Accord in the massive lot filled with cars, trucks, and recreational vehicles. The travel plaza was one of those sprawling commercial complexes that dot the major interstate highways, complete with multiple fast food restaurants, a convenience store, fuel pumps, and even a small arcade area for children. The building itself was designed to accommodate hundreds of travelers simultaneously, with high ceilings, wide corridors, and large windows that provided views of the surrounding countryside. During peak travel times, these facilities buzzed with activity as families, business travelers, and long-haul truckers stopped to refuel both their vehicles and themselves. But despite the busy atmosphere and constant flow of people, I noticed someone watching me from the moment I entered the main building. He was a tall man in his 30s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that might have looked normal on anyone else. But something about his demeanor set him apart from the other travelers. While everyone else moved through the facility with purpose, heading directly toward their intended destinations, this man seemed to have no particular objective other than observing the people around him, and his attention kept returning to me with uncomfortable frequency. I tried to dismiss my uneasiness as paranoia brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep, but as I made my way through the food court area, I could not shake the feeling that I was being systematically evaluated by someone with predatory intentions. The man maintained a careful distance, never getting close enough to seem obviously threatening, but positioning himself where he could monitor my movements while appearing to be engaged in normal travel plaza activities, like browsing magazine racks or checking departure boards. The food court offered the usual selection of chain restaurants, and I settled on a chicken sandwich and fries from one of the more popular establishments. The ordering process took several minutes due to a long line of hungry travelers. And during that time, I noticed that my observer had moved to a table near the seating area where he could watch me without being directly visible from my position in line. He had purchased a cup of coffee and was pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes kept flicking up toward me with the practiced casualness of someone who had done this many times before. When I finally received my order, I chose a table in the center of the seating area, surrounded by families and other travelers who provided a sense of security through their proximity. But even in this crowded environment, I felt exposed and vulnerable, like a deer that has caught the scent of a predator but cannot determine the exact location of the threat. The man with the newspaper had positioned himself 3 tables away, close enough to overhear conversations but far enough to avoid drawing attention from other patrons. I ate my meal quickly, eager to complete my transaction and return to the relative safety of my locked vehicle. But the man made no effort to conceal his interest in my activities. When I stood to dispose of my trash, he folded his newspaper and prepared to follow. When I walked toward the restroom area, he abandoned his coffee and moved to a position near the corridor entrance. It became clear that he was not simply a curious observer, but someone who was actively tracking my movements with some specific purpose in mind. The restroom was located down a long corridor that led away from the main food court area, and I realized as I walked toward it that I would be temporarily isolated from the crowds that had provided my sense of security. But I also knew that biological necessities could not be postponed indefinitely, and I hoped that the restroom would offer a brief respite from the unwelcome attention I had been receiving. I pushed through the door marked for women and immediately felt relieved to discover that the facility was occupied by several other female travelers, including a mother with 2 young daughters who were washing their hands at the sink area. But my relief was short-lived, because within minutes of entering the restroom I heard the main door open and close repeatedly, followed by the sound of footsteps that seemed to be pacing back and forth in the corridor outside. Someone was waiting for me to emerge, and based on the pattern of movement, it appeared to be a single individual rather than a group of people passing through the area. I lingered inside the restroom as long as possible, pretending to check my appearance in the mirror while actually trying to formulate some kind of strategy for dealing with my unwelcome follower. When the mother and her children finally left, I was alone in the restroom with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat and the occasional footstep from the corridor outside. I pulled out my cell phone and considered calling for help, but I realized that I had not actually been threatened or approached directly, which meant that security personnel might dismiss my concerns as overactive imagination. The man had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, never crossing the line into obviously threatening behavior that would justify intervention by authorities. I decided that my best option was to return to the food court and position myself near the information desk or security office, where help would be immediately available if the situation escalated. But when I opened the restroom door and stepped into the corridor, I found my follower standing directly outside, leaning against the wall in a casual pose that would appear innocent to anyone passing by. He smiled when he saw me, and there was something predatory about his expression that made my skin crawl with revulsion and fear. He spoke for the first time since I had noticed him, asking if I was having trouble finding something or if I needed directions to any particular location. His voice was smooth and practiced, with the kind of false friendliness that salespeople use when they are trying to establish trust with potential customers. But there was an underlying current of menace in his tone that made it clear this was not a genuine offer of assistance, but rather an attempt to engage me in conversation and potentially lure me into a more isolated location. I mumbled something about being fine and tried to walk past him toward the main food court area, but he fell into step beside me, maintaining a running commentary about the travel plaza and the various amenities it offered. He mentioned that there were hiking trails behind the building and a picnic area that was much quieter than the crowded interior spaces. He suggested that I might enjoy getting some fresh air before continuing my journey, and he offered to show me the way to these outdoor facilities. The conversation felt like a script that he had rehearsed many times before, and I began to understand that I was not his first potential victim. He had refined his approach through practice, learning to appear helpful and non-threatening while gradually maneuvering his targets toward isolated locations where he could reveal his true intentions. The outdoor areas he was describing would be perfect for an attack, far enough from the main building that screams would not be heard and secluded enough that other travelers would not accidentally interrupt. As we approached the food court, I spotted a state trooper who was purchasing coffee from one of the vendors, and I immediately changed direction to approach him. My follower seemed to understand what I was doing because he suddenly stopped walking and pretended to be interested in a display of travel magazines near the entrance. But instead of abandoning his pursuit entirely, he maintained his position where he could observe my interaction with the officer and resume his stalking once the conversation ended. I explained my situation to the trooper as quietly as possible, describing the behavior I had observed and my growing concern about the man's intentions. The officer listened carefully and agreed that the pattern I described was suspicious enough to warrant investigation. He asked me to point out the individual in question, and when I gestured toward the magazine display, we discovered that the man had vanished completely, apparently slipping away the moment he realized that law enforcement was becoming involved. The trooper took down my information and a detailed description of my follower, explaining that there had been several similar reports at travel plazas throughout Virginia and Maryland over the past few months. The suspect appeared to target young women traveling alone, following them through the facilities and attempting to lure them to isolated areas where attacks could occur without witnesses. Most of the previous incidents had ended with the women managing to escape or seek help before any physical assault occurred, but the pattern suggested a predator who was becoming increasingly bold and persistent. The officer escorted me to my vehicle and waited while I secured my belongings and prepared to continue my journey. He provided me with his direct contact information and instructed me to call immediately if I noticed anyone following me, or if I encountered the same individual at subsequent stops along my route. He also suggested that I avoid stopping at any isolated facilities for the remainder of my trip, sticking to busy truck stops and well-populated rest areas where help would be readily available. I completed my drive to Pennsylvania without further incident, though I found myself constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit and avoiding stops whenever possible. The experience had fundamentally changed my perception of travel plaza safety, and I realized that predators often use these facilities as hunting grounds because they provide access to vulnerable travelers who are temporarily separated from their usual support systems and protective environments. In the weeks that followed, I learned that the state police had identified and arrested a suspect who matched my description, charging him with stalking and attempted assault in connection with multiple incidents at travel plazas throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. He had been using these facilities systematically, spending hours each day observing potential victims and refining his approach based on what worked and what did not. His vehicle contained detailed notes about different travel plazas, including optimal times for hunting and the locations of security cameras and blind spots. The investigation revealed that he had been escalating his behavior over time, becoming more aggressive and persistent with each encounter as he gained confidence in his methods. Several women had reported being followed to their vehicles, and at least 2 had been physically grabbed before managing to escape. The police believed that it was only a matter of time before he had progressed to more serious crimes, and my report had helped them establish the pattern of behavior that led to his eventual capture. That incident taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and seeking help when something feels wrong, even if I cannot articulate exactly what the threat might be. Predators rely on their victims' reluctance to cause scenes or appear paranoid, and they use that social conditioning to their advantage when selecting and stalking potential targets. The crowded environment of a travel plaza can provide a false sense of security, but it can also offer perfect camouflage for someone who knows how to blend in while hunting for vulnerable prey. I still make regular trips between Pennsylvania and Virginia to visit my family, but I approach travel plazas with much greater awareness and caution than I did before that frightening encounter. I have learned to vary my routes and stops, to remain alert to anyone who shows unusual interest in my activities, and to seek help immediately if I feel threatened, rather than hoping that the situation will resolve itself naturally. My parents had not taken us on a road trip in years, not since Mark turned 8 and I was still too young to remember most of our family adventures. But that summer, Dad decided it was time to drive from our home in Denver all the way to his brother's ranch in Montana, a journey he promised would be filled with scenic mountain views and quality family bonding time. Mom packed enough snacks to feed a small army, and my little sister Sarah bounced excitedly in her booster seat as we loaded up our aging Suburban for what was supposed to be a 12-hour drive through some of the most beautiful countryside in America. We left at dawn on a Saturday morning, with Dad insisting we could make the trip in one day if we kept our stops to a minimum. The first few hours were everything he had promised, with golden wheat fields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway, and the Rocky Mountains growing larger and more imposing with each passing mile. Sarah and I played travel games and listened to music on our portable CD players, while Mom read aloud from a guidebook about all the historical landmarks we would encounter along the way. But somewhere around hour 6, just as we crossed into Wyoming, Sarah began complaining of stomach cramps. At first, Mom thought it was just car sickness from too many snacks in the winding mountain roads, but when Sarah started crying and holding her side, it became clear that something more serious was happening. Dad pulled over at the first rest stop he could find, a weathered concrete structure with picnic tables and restroom facilities that sat alone in a valley surrounded by towering pine forests. The rest stop was nearly deserted when we arrived, with only a single RV parked at the far end of the lot and what appeared to be a maintenance truck near the restroom building. Dad carried Sarah to one of the picnic tables while Mom rummaged through her purse for the children's medicine she always packed on trips. But Sarah's condition seemed to be getting worse by the minute, and when she started vomiting, Mom made the decision that we needed to find the nearest hospital immediately. The problem was that we were in the middle of nowhere, at least 40 miles from the nearest town according to our road atlas, and Sarah was in no condition to endure another hour of mountain driving. Dad decided that Mom should stay with Sarah at the rest stop while he drove into town to find help and bring back either a doctor or an ambulance. It seemed like the most logical plan at the time, though looking back now I realize how many things could have gone wrong with that decision. I was supposed to stay with Mom and Sarah, but at 8 years old I was more interested in exploring the hiking trails that led into the forest behind the rest stop. While my parents were focused on Sarah's condition and discussing their options, I wandered away from the picnic area and discovered a narrow path that wound between the massive pine trees, disappearing into the shadows of the deep woods. The trail was marked with small wooden signs that promised a scenic overlook just half a mile ahead, and I was curious to see what kind of view it might offer. The forest was cooler and darker than I had expected, with thick canopy blocking out most of the afternoon sunlight and creating an almost twilight atmosphere even though it was barely past 2 o'clock. I followed the trail for what felt like several minutes, listening to the sound of my footsteps on the packed earth and the distant calls of birds. Somewhere high in the branches above me, the air smelled of pine needles and damp soil, and I felt like I was walking through an enchanted forest from one of the fairy tales Mom used to read to us. But when I turned around to look back toward the rest stop, I realized I could no longer see the parking lot or hear the sound of cars on the highway. The trail had curved and twisted through the trees more than I had noticed, and everything around me looked identical. Just endless rows of towering pines stretching in every direction. I started to feel the first flutter of panic in my chest as I realized I might be lost. But I tried to stay calm and retrace my steps back the way I had come. That was when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it might be other hikers or maybe park rangers, but as I moved closer to the sound, I realized there was something wrong with the way they were talking. The voices were low and urgent, with a secretive quality that made me instinctively want to hide rather than call out for help. I crept behind a large boulder near the edge of a small clearing and peered through the underbrush to see what was happening. 3 men were standing in a circle near what appeared to be a makeshift campsite, complete with a camouflage tarp stretched between several trees and camping equipment scattered around a cold fire pit. 2 of the men were dressed in hunting clothes, but the third wore the same type of maintenance uniform I had seen on the truck back at the rest stop. They were examining something spread out on a folding table, and when one of them moved aside, I could see that it was a collection of photographs and what looked like personal items, including driver's licenses and jewelry. The maintenance man was pointing to one of the photographs and speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the still forest air. He was describing a woman with blonde hair and 2 children, one about 8 years old and a younger girl who had stopped at the rest area that afternoon. My blood turned to ice as I realized he was talking about my family and that somehow these men had been watching us from the moment we arrived. One of the hunters asked about the timing, and the maintenance man checked his watch before explaining that the father had left about 20 minutes ago, which meant it would be at least an hour before he returned with help. He said the mother and children were alone and vulnerable, and that this was the perfect opportunity they had been waiting for. The other hunter asked about the RV at the far end of the parking lot, and the maintenance man laughed, saying that those people had been taken care of the previous day and would not be a problem. I had heard enough to understand that my family was in immediate danger, but I was completely lost in the forest with no idea how to find my way back to warn them. The men were still talking about their plans, and from what I could gather, they intended to wait until dark before making their move, which gave me perhaps 2 hours to find help or find my way back to the rest stop. I started moving as quietly as possible away from their campsite, trying to follow what I hoped was the direction back to the trail. The next hour was the longest of my young life, as I stumbled through the forest trying to navigate by the position of the sun through the tree canopy, and the sound of distant traffic that seemed to come from every direction at once. I fell into streams, scraped my arms on thorny underbrush, and fought back tears of frustration and fear as I searched desperately for any landmark that might guide me back to safety. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, and I spent 10 terrifying minutes hiding behind a fallen log, convinced that one of the men had discovered my presence and was hunting me through the woods. But finally, just as the shadows were beginning to lengthen and I was starting to lose hope, I spotted the concrete roof of the rest stop building through the trees ahead. I ran the final 100 yards without caring about the noise I was making, bursting out of the forest and into the parking lot where I found Mom sitting at the same picnic table, still holding Sarah and looking anxiously toward the highway for any sign of Dad's return. I tried to explain what I had seen and heard, but I was crying and out of breath, and Mom initially thought I was just scared from getting lost in the woods. It was not until I mentioned the specific details about the photographs and the maintenance truck that she realized I was telling the truth about something genuinely threatening. She gathered up Sarah and our belongings, and we ran to our Suburban, locking all the doors and sitting in terrified silence as we waited for Dad to return. When Dad finally arrived with a local doctor and a sheriff's deputy, they found the maintenance truck abandoned near the restroom building, and a search of the surrounding forest revealed the campsite I had described, complete with evidence of multiple previous crimes. The 3 men were arrested 2 days later at a truck stop in Idaho, and we learned that they had been using the remote rest area as a hunting ground for months, targeting isolated families and lone travelers who stopped there during their cross-country journeys. The RV that had been parked at the far end of the lot was found buried in a shallow grove about a mile into the forest, along with the remains of an elderly couple from California who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah recovered from what turned out to be acute appendicitis, but it was months before any of us could talk about what might have happened if I had not stumbled across that campsite and overheard their plans. We never finished that road trip to Montana, and my family has not taken a long car journey together since. But I learned that sometimes the most innocent family moments can become something far more sinister, and that predators often hide in plain sight, wearing uniforms and smiles that make them seem helpful rather than dangerous. The forest may have been beautiful and peaceful on the surface, but it was also hiding secrets that could have destroyed my family forever. It was 2:17 a.m. when my gas gauge hit empty and the yellow warning light began its relentless blinking on my dashboard. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, pushing through the monotonous stretch of Interstate 40 that cuts through the heart of Oklahoma, heading back to college after a long weekend visiting my girlfriend Kyle back home. The highway was deserted at this hour, nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in both directions, broken only by the occasional semi-truck thundering past in the opposite lane, its headlights briefly illuminating the barren landscape before disappearing into the night. The nearest rest stop, according to my GPS, was still 12 miles ahead, but with my fuel tank running on fumes, I knew I would never make it that far. My heart sank when I spotted the faded exit sign for what appeared to be the only gas station within a 30-mile radius. The sign was weathered and partially obscured by rust stains advertising a place called Quick Stop, with an arrow pointing down a narrow off-ramp that seemed to vanish into complete darkness. I had no choice but to take the gamble. The off-ramp descended into what felt like a forgotten corner of the world. The overhead highway lights disappeared behind me, and my headlights became the only source of illumination cutting through the thick Oklahoma night. The road was cracked and poorly maintained, with weeds growing up through the asphalt and no reflective lane markers to guide the way. After about 2 miles of winding through what appeared to be abandoned farmland, I finally saw the harsh fluorescent glow of the Quick Stop rising from the darkness like some kind of beacon. The gas station sat alone in a sea of cracked concrete, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and a few skeletal trees that swayed ominously in the night breeze. The building itself looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1980s, with faded yellow and red paint peeling from its walls and a collection of vintage soda advertisements plastered across the windows. 2 fuel pumps stood under a flickering canopy light that cast strange shadows across the forecourt, and I could see through the grimy windows that a single clerk was manning the register inside. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building, keeping my engine running while I assessed my surroundings. The place felt wrong somehow, though I could not immediately put my finger on what was bothering me. Perhaps it was the complete isolation, or the way the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical buzz that seemed too loud in the silence, or maybe it was just the exhaustion from my long drive playing tricks on my mind. I turned off my engine and stepped out into the cool night air, immediately noticing how the silence seemed to press in around me like a physical presence. The fuel pump was an ancient model that required payment inside, so I walked across the cracked pavement toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing strangely in the stillness. Through the glass door, I could see the clerk behind the counter, a thin man in his 50s wearing a stained uniform shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked up as I approached, and something about his smile made me pause for just a moment before pushing through the door. The interior of the station was cramped and cluttered, with narrow aisles packed with dusty merchandise and a lingering smell of stale cigarettes and motor oil. The clerk watched me with an intensity that felt uncomfortable, his pale eyes tracking my movements as I grabbed a bag of chips and an energy drink from the cooler. When I approached the counter to prepay for my gas, he leaned forward slightly, and I noticed his fingernails were unusually long and yellowed. "Traveling alone tonight?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange lilt that made the innocent question sound somehow predatory. I nodded curtly and handed him 2 $20 bills, eager to complete my transaction and get back on the road. He processed the payment with deliberate slowness, his fingers lingering on mine when he handed me the receipt, and his smile widened to reveal teeth that were stained brown from years of tobacco use. Outside, I hurried to my car and began filling my tank, constantly glancing over my shoulder toward the station windows. The clerk had moved from behind the counter and was now standing directly at the glass, watching me with that same unsettling smile. The fuel pump seemed to be dispensing gas at an unusually slow rate, and with each passing minute I felt my anxiety building like pressure in a kettle about to boil over. That was when I noticed the pickup truck. It had been parked behind the building when I arrived, barely visible in the shadows, but now it was idling near the edge of the property with its headlights off. I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat, though I could not determine if they were watching me or simply waiting. My hands began to shake as I gripped the fuel nozzle, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave immediately. The gas pump finally clicked off at $37, still several dollars short of what I had paid, but I did not care about the difference. I hung up the nozzle with trembling fingers and rushed back toward my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard the pickup truck engine rev behind me. When I spun around, I saw that it had moved closer, now positioned directly between my vehicle and the exit, effectively blocking my most direct route back to the highway. Through my rearview mirror, I watched as the clerk emerged from the station and began walking casually across the parking lot toward my car. He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, and in his right hand I could see the metallic glint of what appeared to be a large wrench or tire iron. The pickup truck door opened, and a second figure stepped out, this one wearing dark clothing and a ski mask despite the warm September night. My engine turned over on the third try, and I threw the transmission into reverse, backing away from the pump at dangerous speed. The clerk had to jump aside to avoid being hit, and I heard him shout something that was lost in the sound of my spinning tires on the loose gravel. The pickup truck lurched forward to maintain its blocking position, but I had already committed to a different escape route, steering my car across the rough terrain behind the station building. My suspension protested as I bounced over deep ruts and scattered debris, but I kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, using my headlights to navigate between rusted barrels and abandoned equipment. In my rearview mirror, I could see both men running back toward the pickup truck, and within seconds its headlights flared to life as they began their pursuit across the uneven ground. I reached a chain-link fence that separated the station property from an adjacent field, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was trapped. But years of neglect had left a section of the fencing partially collapsed, and I was able to drive through the gap, my car scraping against the twisted metal posts as I forced my way into the open pasture beyond. The pickup truck was larger and heavier, and I gained precious seconds as they struggled to navigate the same obstacle. The field was a maze of irrigation ditches and scattered hay bales, and I drove by pure instinct, following what appeared to be a farm road that led toward a distant line of trees. My headlights swept back and forth as I searched for the path, and behind me I could see the pickup truck gaining ground, its more powerful engine and four-wheel drive giving it a significant advantage over my compact sedan on the rough terrain. Just when I thought they would overtake me, I spotted another road running parallel to the tree line, and beyond that, the blessed sight of highway lights in the distance. I pushed my car harder than I ever had before, the engine screaming in protest as I bounced and skidded across the final stretch of open ground. The pickup truck made one last desperate surge to cut me off, but I managed to reach the paved road with perhaps 50 yards to spare. Once I merged back onto the interstate, I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to stop at a proper rest area with security cameras and other travelers. My hands were still shaking as I called the state police to report what had happened, though I was not surprised when they told me that the gas station had been abandoned for over 3 years, and that local authorities had received similar reports from other travelers who claimed to have been lured there by outdated GPS databases. I never found out what those men had planned for me that night, and I try not to think about what might have happened if I had been less alert, or if my car had broken down in that isolated place. But I learned an important lesson about trusting my instincts and the dangers that can lurk in the dark spaces between cities, where predators wait patiently for vulnerable travelers who have no choice but to stop. Now, whenever I take long trips, I make sure to fill my tank before the sun goes down, and I research my route carefully to avoid any remote stops that might put me in a similar situation. That night taught me that the real monsters are not the ones we imagine in our nightmares, but the ones who smile at us from behind a counter and ask if we are traveling alone. The engine started making that grinding noise just past midnight, somewhere along a desolate stretch of Interstate 70 that cuts through the heart of Kansas wheat country. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, making the journey from my college in Colorado back to my family home in Missouri for spring break. And I was still at least 3 hours away from my destination when my 10-year-old Honda Civic began protesting the long trip. At first, it was just a subtle vibration in the steering wheel, but within minutes the noise had escalated to a metallic scraping sound that could not be ignored. Jessica was my name then, though I go by Jess now, and at 20 years old I had never experienced a serious car breakdown during a long-distance trip. My father had always handled the maintenance on my vehicle, and I naively assumed that regular oil changes and tire rotations were sufficient to prevent any major mechanical failures. But as the grinding noise grew louder and my engine temperature gauge began climbing toward the red zone, I realized that my automotive ignorance was about to become a serious problem. The highway was virtually empty at that hour, with nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in both directions and only the occasional semi-truck rumbling past at highway speeds. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which was not unusual for this remote section of Kansas, where cell towers are spaced dozens of miles apart and entire counties can be dead zones for wireless communication. The nearest town, according to my road atlas, was still 15 miles ahead, but with steam beginning to rise from under my hood, I knew I would never make it that far. I spotted the exit sign for what appeared to be a rest area about 2 miles ahead, and I coaxed my failing vehicle down the off-ramp with the engine temperature gauge now firmly planted in the danger zone. The rest stop was nothing more than a small parking area with a few picnic tables and a concrete restroom building, surrounded by fields of winter wheat that stretched to the horizon under a moonless sky. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no emergency phone, and no attendant on duty, just a single security light that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I turned off my engine and sat in the darkness for several minutes, listening to the metallic pinging sounds of cooling metal and trying to formulate some kind of plan. My trunk contained a small toolkit that my father had insisted I carry, but I had never learned to use most of the tools, and attempting repairs in the middle of the night seemed both dangerous and futile. My best option appeared to be waiting until dawn and hoping that another traveler would stop and offer assistance, or that my cell phone might pick up a signal as the towers switched to different transmission patterns during off-peak hours. I decided to check the restroom facilities and then settle in for what promised to be a long and uncomfortable night in my car. The restroom building was a typical highway department structure, built from cinder blocks and painted in that institutional beige color that seems to be standard for government facilities. The women's side was accessed through a heavy metal door that squeaked loudly on rusted hinges, and the interior was illuminated by a single fluorescent fixture that flickered intermittently and cast strange shadows on the concrete walls. The facilities were clean enough, though clearly not maintained very frequently, and I was grateful to discover that the water was still running and the toilet paper dispensers were not empty. But as I was washing my hands at the small sink, I heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot outside. My first reaction was relief, thinking that help had finally arrived, but something about the way the engine idled, low and rumbling like a large pickup truck or van, made me pause before rushing outside to flag down the driver. Through the small frosted window near the sink, I could see headlights positioned near my disabled Honda, and I watched as a tall figure got out of what appeared to be a dark-colored pickup truck and began walking around my vehicle. The person was carrying some kind of flashlight or lantern, and they seemed to be examining my car with more interest than a casual Good Samaritan might display. Instead of approaching the restroom building to look for the stranded motorist, they spent several minutes checking my license plates and peering through my windows at the personal belongings I had left on the seats. I remained frozen by the window, watching as the figure returned to their truck and appeared to be speaking with someone else inside the vehicle. The passenger door opened and a second person emerged, this one shorter but moving with the same deliberate manner as they approached my car from the opposite side. Both figures were now circling my Honda like predators examining their prey, and I realized with growing alarm that they had made no attempt to locate me or offer assistance despite the obvious breakdown situation. The shorter figure produced what looked like a crowbar or prying tool and began working on my driver's side door, while the taller person kept watch toward the restroom building. I understood with crystal clarity that these were not good Samaritans stopping to help a stranded motorist, but opportunists who had spotted a vulnerable young woman's vehicle and decided to take advantage of the situation. My personal belongings, including my purse and laptop computer, were visible through the windows, and they were clearly planning to burglarize my car while assuming I was either asleep inside or had wandered away from the area. But then the shorter figure said something to their companion, and both of them turned their attention toward the restroom building where I was hiding. The taller person began walking directly toward the women's entrance, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. I realized they had spotted evidence of my presence, perhaps footprints in the gravel or the fact that my car keys were missing from the ignition, and they were coming to find me. The restroom building had only one entrance and no windows large enough to climb through, which meant I was essentially trapped with nowhere to run or hide. The fluorescent light continued its erratic flickering, creating a strobe effect that made everything seem surreal and nightmarish. And I could hear footsteps approaching the metal door with deliberate slowness. I looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon, settling on a metal trash can that I could potentially use to defend myself if necessary. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I held my breath as the handle began to turn with a metallic scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. But instead of bursting in immediately, the person seemed to be listening, perhaps trying to determine if I was actually inside or if the building was empty. I pressed myself against the concrete wall beside the door, gripping the trash can and preparing for whatever was about to happen. That was when I heard the distant sound of another vehicle approaching from the highway, its headlights sweeping across the parking lot as it descended the exit ramp. The footsteps outside the door immediately retreated, and through the small window, I watched as both figures ran back toward their pickup truck with obvious urgency. Within seconds, their vehicle was speeding away into the darkness, leaving me alone with my disabled Honda and whoever was arriving in the new vehicle. The newcomer turned out to be a long-haul trucker who had noticed my car with its hood up and decided to check if anyone needed assistance. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a genuine desire to help, and when I explained what had just happened with the two suspicious individuals, he immediately contacted the state police on his CB radio. He also had enough mechanical knowledge to diagnose my engine problem as a broken water pump, which explained the overheating and grinding noises I had been experiencing. The trucker stayed with me until a state trooper arrived about 30 minutes later, and together they helped arrange for a tow truck to transport my Honda to the nearest repair shop. The officer took a detailed report about the incident with the pickup truck and the attempted break-in, though he explained that without license plate numbers or better descriptions of the suspects, there was little chance of tracking them down. He did mention that there had been several similar reports along that stretch of highway over the past few months, involving stranded motorists who were targeted by opportunistic criminals. I never found out what those two individuals had planned for me that night, and I try not to think about what might have happened if the trucker had not arrived when he did. The repair shop was able to fix my water pump the following day, and I completed my journey home to Missouri without further incident, though the experience had fundamentally changed my perspective on highway travel and personal safety. Since that night, I have never undertaken a long-distance trip without ensuring my vehicle is in perfect mechanical condition, and I carry a fully charged cell phone with a car charger as backup. I also invested in a roadside assistance plan and learned basic automotive troubleshooting from my father so I would never again be completely helpless in a breakdown situation. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts about dangerous situations and the importance of having an escape plan even when you feel trapped. The Kansas wheat fields may look peaceful and harmless during daylight hours, but they can hide predators who prey on vulnerable travelers during the darkest hours of the night. That broken water pump probably saved my life by forcing me to hide in that restroom building, because if I had been sleeping in my car when those men arrived, this story might have had a very different ending. After 6 hours of driving, I could not wait any longer. My bladder felt like it was about to burst, and the next rest stop, according to the highway signs, was still another 20 miles ahead on Interstate 77 through the mountains of West Virginia. I was 17 years old and on my first solo road trip, driving from my hometown in Ohio to visit my aunt in North Carolina for the summer. My parents had been reluctant to let me make the journey alone, but I had finally convinced them that I was mature enough to handle the responsibility of 8 hours behind the wheel. David was what everyone called me then, though most people use Dave now. And I had been looking forward to this trip for months as a symbol of my growing independence and adulthood. My father had spent weeks preparing my car for the journey, checking the oil and tire pressure and making sure I had emergency supplies in case of a breakdown. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for what I was about to encounter at a seemingly innocent rest area tucked into the mountains of rural West Virginia. The rest stop appeared just as I was reaching the point of desperation, marked by a small brown sign that indicated facilities and picnic tables were available 1 mile ahead. I took the exit with relief flooding through me, following a winding access road that descended into a small valley surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The facility was larger than I had expected, with a substantial brick building that housed separate men's and women's restrooms, along with a collection of picnic tables and vending machines arranged under a covered pavilion. There were several other vehicles in the parking lot when I arrived, including a family with young children who were eating lunch at one of the picnic tables, and an elderly couple walking their small dog along a nature trail that led into the surrounding woods. The scene looked perfectly normal and peaceful, with birds singing in the trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of mountain wildflowers through the clean air. I parked near the restroom building and hurried inside, grateful to finally address the physical discomfort that had been building for the past hour. The men's restroom was a typical highway facility with white tile walls and industrial fixtures that showed signs of heavy use, but appeared to be reasonably clean and well maintained. There were 3 urinals along one wall and 2 toilet stalls on the opposite side, with a row of sinks and mirrors near the entrance. The lighting was provided by fluorescent fixtures that hummed quietly overhead, and everything smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with the faint odor of pine trees drifting in through a small ventilation window. I was standing at the middle urinal, finally experiencing the relief I had been craving for the past hour, when I heard the main door open behind me. Footsteps crossed the tile floor with a deliberate pace that seemed somehow different from the casual gait of other travelers I had encountered during my journey. Instead of proceeding directly to one of the other fixtures, the person stopped somewhere near the sinks, and I could feel their presence behind me like a weight pressing against my shoulders. The normal sounds of a rest area seemed to fade away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that stretched on for far longer than felt natural. I finished what I was doing and moved toward the sinks to wash my hands, glancing in the mirror to see who had entered behind me. The reflection showed a middle-aged man wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, standing motionless near the paper towel dispenser with his hands at his sides. He was not using any of the facilities, just watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I reached for the soap dispenser, the man moved closer, positioning himself directly behind me with no apparent purpose other than to invade my personal space. I could see his reflection more clearly now, and there was something wrong with his expression, a predatory smile that revealed yellowed teeth and eyes that seemed to be evaluating me like a hunter sizing up potential prey. He was larger than me by at least 50 pounds and several inches in height, and his presence filled the small restroom with an atmosphere of menace that made my heart begin to race. I tried to finish washing my hands as quickly as possible, but the man spoke before I could reach for a paper towel. His voice was low and gravelly with an accent I could not immediately place, and his words made my blood freeze in my veins. He asked if I was traveling alone, and when I did not respond immediately, he stepped even closer, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and unwashed clothing and something else that might have been fear or excitement. The question felt like a trap because answering truthfully would confirm my vulnerability, but lying might provoke him into some kind of aggressive response. I mumbled something non-committal about meeting friends nearby, trying to project confidence I did not feel while edging toward the exit. But the man moved to block my path, his smile widening as he realized that I was frightened and looking for a way to escape the confined space. He began asking more questions about my destination and travel plans, each query becoming more personal and intrusive than the last. He wanted to know where I was staying, whether anyone was expecting me at a specific time, and how long I planned to be in the area. His tone remained conversational, but there was an underlying threat in his demeanor that made it clear these were not innocent inquiries from a friendly fellow traveler. I tried to push past him toward the door, but he grabbed my arm with a grip that was painful and left no doubt about his intentions. He pulled me back from the exit and pressed me against the sink counter, his face now close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. He whispered that he had been watching me since I arrived, and that he knew I was alone and vulnerable. He described in disturbing detail what he planned to do, and I realized that I was in immediate physical danger with no obvious way to call for help. The restroom door was heavy and would muffle any sounds I might make, and the family I had seen outside was probably too far away to hear me scream. The man seemed to understand this as well because his grip on my arm tightened and he began forcing me toward one of the toilet stalls at the back of the restroom. I could see that he had planned this encounter carefully, choosing a location where he could corner his victims without interference from other travelers. But as he pushed me toward the stall, I remembered something my father had taught me about self-defense during our preparation for this trip. He had emphasized that in a dangerous situation, the most important thing was to create enough chaos and noise to attract attention from other people nearby. I stopped resisting his grip and instead threw my full weight backward into him, driving my elbow into his ribs as hard as I could while simultaneously screaming at the top of my lungs. The sudden reversal caught him off guard, and his grip loosened enough for me to break free and sprint toward the exit. I burst through the door and into the bright sunlight, still screaming for help and running toward the family at the picnic tables. The man followed me outside, but when he saw that other people were now aware of the situation and looking in our direction, he quickly changed course and headed toward a dark-colored van parked at the far end of the lot. The father from the family rushed over to help me, and together we watched as the van sped away from the rest area and back onto the highway. The man called 911 on his cell phone while his wife comforted me and helped me calm down enough to provide a coherent account of what had happened. The state police arrived within 20 minutes and took a detailed report, though the officer explained that without a license plate number, it would be difficult to track down the suspect. The trooper did mention that there had been several similar incidents reported at rest areas throughout West Virginia and neighboring states over the past year, all involving a middle-aged man who targeted young travelers, particularly those who appeared to be alone and vulnerable. He suspected that this individual was working a circuit of remote rest stops, moving from location to location to avoid detection while preying on unsuspecting victims. I completed my journey to North Carolina that same day, though I made sure to use only busy truck stops and well-populated rest areas for the remainder of the trip. The experience had shaken my confidence badly, and it took several weeks before I felt comfortable being alone in public restrooms or other isolated spaces. My parents were understandably upset when I told them what had happened, and they insisted on driving down to escort me home at the end of the summer. That encounter taught me valuable lessons about situational awareness and the importance of trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. I learned that predators often rely on the social conditioning that makes us reluctant to cause scenes or appear rude, and that sometimes being loud and disruptive can be the difference between becoming a victim and escaping unharmed. The mountains of West Virginia are beautiful and peaceful, but they also provide perfect cover for individuals who prey on travelers passing through remote areas. I never found out what that man had planned for me in that restroom, and I hope I never encounter anyone like him again. But I will always be grateful for the self-defense lessons my father insisted on teaching me, because they probably saved my life that day. With a crying baby and a full diaper bag, I desperately needed to find a place to change my 6-month-old son and take care of his increasingly urgent needs. I had been driving for nearly 5 hours from my home in Atlanta to visit my mother in Jacksonville, and little Seth had been fussing for the past hour despite my attempts to soothe him with music and snacks. The travel plaza that appeared on my GPS seemed like the perfect solution, advertising family restrooms and baby-changing facilities that would allow me to address his needs in a clean and private environment. My name is David, though most people call me Dave, and at 29 years old, I was still adjusting to the challenges of single parenthood after my wife had left us 6 months earlier. This was only my second long-distance trip alone with Seth, and I was learning that traveling with an infant required much more planning and flexibility than I had previously realized. Every stop became a complex operation involving diaper bags, bottles, and the constant worry about his safety and comfort in unfamiliar environments. The Travel Plaza was one of those large commercial complexes that serve multiple interstate highways with dozens of fuel pumps, several fast food restaurants, and a sprawling main building that housed everything from convenience stores to tourist information centers. It was exactly the type of busy, well-maintained facility that I preferred when traveling with Seth, because the constant flow of families and business travelers provided both security and the amenities that made infant care more manageable. I parked near the main entrance and gathered the supplies I would need for what I hoped would be a quick diaper change and feeding session. Seth's crying had escalated to the point where other travelers in the parking lot were beginning to notice, and I felt the familiar pressure of being a single father in public with a distressed child. The diaper bag felt heavier than usual as I slung it over my shoulder and lifted Seth from his car seat, trying to project competence and control while internally feeling overwhelmed by the logistics of the situation. The family restroom was located down a long corridor that branched off from the main food court area, clearly marked with colorful signs that advertised baby changing stations and private spaces for families with young children. The corridor was well lit and appeared to be regularly maintained, with clean tile floors and walls decorated with cheerful murals that were obviously designed to create a welcoming atmosphere for traveling families. Several other families were moving through the area, which added to my sense that this was a safe and appropriate place to tend to Seth's needs. The family restroom itself was larger and better equipped than I had expected, with a proper changing table, a comfortable chair for nursing mothers, and even a small sink at an appropriate height for children. Everything appeared to be clean and well maintained, and I felt relieved to have found such a suitable space for taking care of Seth's immediate needs. I locked the door behind us and began the familiar routine of laying out a changing pad and gathering the supplies I would need. Seth had calmed down somewhat once we were in the quiet environment of the restroom, and I was able to change his diaper efficiently and clean him up without the usual struggle that sometimes accompanied these necessary tasks. But just as I was finishing with the diaper change and preparing to give him a bottle, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by what sounded like someone testing the door handle to see if the room was occupied. At first, I assumed it was simply another family waiting to use the facility, and I called out that I would be finished in just a few more minutes. But instead of moving on to find another restroom or waiting patiently in the corridor, the person outside began knocking on the door with increasing persistence and urgency. The knocking quickly escalated to pounding, and I could hear a male voice demanding that I open the door immediately. The voice was aggressive and threatening in a way that made it clear this was not a normal request from another traveler, and I felt my heart rate increase as I realized that Seth and I might be in danger. The man outside was shouting that he knew I was in there with a baby, and that he had been watching me since I arrived at the travel plaza. He described details about my car and my appearance that proved he had indeed been observing me, and his knowledge of these specifics made the situation feel much more threatening than a random encounter. I gathered Seth close to my chest and moved to the far corner of the restroom, as far from the door as possible, while trying to think of some way to call for help or escape the situation. My cell phone was in my back pocket, but I was afraid that taking the time to dial 911 might provoke the man outside into more aggressive action. The family restroom had seemed like such a secure space when I had entered, but now it felt like a trap that had left us vulnerable and isolated from the safety of the crowded main building. The pounding on the door continued for what felt like several minutes, accompanied by increasingly disturbing statements about what the man intended to do once he gained access to the room. He seemed to understand that I was trapped and had no immediate way to escape, and his confidence was growing with each passing moment. Seth had begun crying again in response to the noise and my obvious distress, which only seemed to encourage the man outside to become more aggressive in his demands. But then, suddenly, the pounding stopped, and I could hear the sound of multiple voices in the corridor outside. Someone else had apparently heard the commotion and come to investigate, and the aggressive man was now trying to explain his behavior to what sounded like a security guard or law enforcement officer. I could not make out all the words being spoken, but the tone had changed dramatically from threatening to defensive, and the man seemed to be trying to minimize the situation. I waited several more minutes before cautiously unlocking the door and peering out into the corridor, where I found a travel plaza security guard speaking with a state trooper who had apparently been called to investigate the disturbance. They explained that the man had been arrested and removed from the facility, and that several other travelers had reported seeing him following families with young children throughout the travel plaza. His behavior had escalated over the course of the afternoon, and my encounter had been the most serious incident so far. The security guard walked Seth and me back to our car and waited while I secured him in his car seat and loaded our belongings. He explained that the man had been targeting single parents, particularly fathers traveling alone with infants, because he believed they would be less likely to put up resistance or call for help when confronted. The family restroom had been part of his strategy because it provided a private space where he could corner his intended victims without interference from other travelers. The trooper took a detailed report and provided me with case numbers and contact information for following up on the investigation. He mentioned that similar incidents had been reported at travel plazas throughout Georgia and Florida over the past month, and that they suspected this individual was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families during highway travel. The arrest might help them connect him to other unsolved cases in the region. I completed my journey to Jacksonville that day, but the experience had fundamentally changed my approach to traveling with Seth and my awareness of the potential dangers that could lurk in seemingly safe family facilities. What had started as a routine stop to address my infant son's needs had turned into a terrifying encounter that could have had much worse consequences if other travelers had not intervened when they did. Since that day, I have never used a family restroom without first ensuring that other people are aware of my presence and approximate timeline for completing my business. I also invested in a personal safety device that could summon help quickly if needed, and I developed relationships with other single parents who could provide mutual support and awareness during travel situations. The travel plaza industry markets these family facilities as safe havens for parents and children, but my experience taught me that predators understand this marketing as well and use it to identify and target vulnerable victims. I thought leaving at 5 a.m. would mean empty highways and a peaceful drive from my apartment in Chicago to the medical residency program in Houston, where I was scheduled to begin orientation on Monday morning. Kay was what everyone called me, though my full name is Catherine. And at 25 years old, I had just completed medical school and was embarking on what I hoped would be a prestigious surgical residency at one of the top teaching hospitals in Texas. The drive was supposed to take about 14 hours, and I had planned to make it in a single day with minimal stops to ensure I arrived well-rested for the demanding schedule that awaited me. My Honda Civic was packed with everything I owned, from medical textbooks and surgical instruments to personal belongings, and enough clothes to last through my first few months of residency. The early departure time was part of my strategy to avoid the heavy traffic that typically plagued Interstate 45 through Dallas. And I had calculated that starting before dawn would allow me to reach Houston by early evening with plenty of time to settle into my new apartment and prepare for the following day. The first few hours of the drive went exactly as planned, with virtually no traffic on the highway and perfect weather conditions that made for easy driving. I stopped once for fuel and coffee at a large truck stop near the Arkansas border. But the transaction was quick and I was back on the road within 15 minutes. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made excellent progress and was ahead of my planned schedule, which allowed me to relax and enjoy the scenic countryside of eastern Texas. But somewhere around 11 a.m., as I approached the outskirts of Dallas, I began to notice a pattern in the vehicles around me that made me increasingly uncomfortable. 3 different cars seemed to be maintaining the same relative positions to my Honda, regardless of changes in traffic patterns or my own adjustments to speed and lane position. At first, I dismissed this as coincidence, but as the pattern continued for more than 30 miles, I began to suspect that I was being deliberately followed by multiple vehicles working in coordination. The cars were unremarkable: a white sedan, a dark SUV, and a pickup truck that looked like thousands of others on Texas highways. But their behavior was distinctly abnormal because they maintained formation around my vehicle in a way that suggested they were communicating with each other and following some kind of predetermined plan. When I changed lanes, at least one of them would mirror my movement within a few seconds. When I adjusted my speed, they would make corresponding adjustments to maintain their relative positions. I decided to test my suspicions by taking an exit for what appeared to be a large rest area, thinking that if these vehicles were simply coincidentally traveling in the same direction, they would continue on the highway rather than following me off the main route. But to my growing alarm, all 3 vehicles followed me down the exit ramp and into the rest area parking lot, where they positioned themselves in different sections of the facility in a way that provided them with clear sight lines to my Honda from multiple angles. The rest area was larger than most, with separate parking sections for passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, along with a substantial main building that housed restaurants, gift shops, and tourist information displays. Under normal circumstances, it would have felt like a safe and welcoming place to take a break during a long journey, but the presence of my apparent followers had transformed it into something that felt more like a trap than a refuge. I parked near the main entrance and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The 3 vehicles that had followed me were positioned strategically throughout the parking lot, and I could see at least 2 of their occupants using cell phones, presumably to coordinate whatever they had planned. It was clear that this was not a random encounter, but rather a carefully orchestrated operation that involved multiple participants and advanced planning. One of the vehicles, the white sedan, was parked near the exit in a position that would allow its occupants to follow me if I attempted to leave the rest area. The dark SUV had positioned itself near the fuel pumps where its driver could observe both the main building entrance and my parking spot. The pickup truck was parked in the commercial vehicle section, but close enough to the passenger car area that its occupant could quickly reach my location on foot if necessary. As I watched, a man got out of the pickup truck and began walking casually toward the main building, but his path took him directly past my Honda in a way that allowed him to examine my vehicle and its contents. He was tall and wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and something about his demeanor suggested that this was reconnaissance rather than a coincidence. When he passed my car, he paused slightly and appeared to be memorizing details about my license plate and the personal belongings visible through my windows. I realized that I needed to seek help immediately before whatever these people had planned could be put into motion. The main building was busy with other travelers, including families with children and elderly couples, which suggested that help would be available if I could reach the safety of the crowded interior. But the distance from my parking spot to the entrance felt like an enormous gap that would leave me exposed and vulnerable to anyone who wanted to approach me. I gathered my purse and cell phone and made a quick dash from my car to the main building, moving as fast as possible while trying not to appear panicked or draw unnecessary attention to myself. Once inside, I immediately sought out the information desk and explained my situation to the attendant, a middle-aged woman who took my concerns seriously and directed me to the rest area security office. The security guard listened to my account and agreed to accompany me back to my vehicle while calling for assistance from local law enforcement. But when we returned to the parking lot, all 3 of the suspicious vehicles had vanished, apparently having fled the scene once they realized that I had sought help and that security personnel were becoming involved in the situation. The state trooper who responded to the call took a detailed report and explained that there had been several similar incidents reported along Interstate 45 over the past few months, involving what appeared to be organized groups that targeted lone travelers, particularly young women driving expensive vehicles or those who appeared to be carrying valuable belongings. The tactics I described matched the pattern of behavior that had been observed in other cases, including the use of multiple vehicles to box in their targets and the strategic positioning at rest areas to prevent escape. The trooper followed me for the next 50 miles to ensure that I was not being followed by other vehicles, and he provided me with contact information for law enforcement agencies along my remaining route in case I encountered any further problems. He also suggested that I avoid stopping at isolated rest areas for the remainder of my journey, sticking instead to busy truck stops and well-populated facilities where help would be readily available. I completed my drive to Houston without further incident, arriving safely at my new apartment complex where security personnel helped me unload my belongings and park my car in a secure garage. The experience had been terrifying, but it also taught me valuable lessons about highway safety and the importance of trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. The investigation that followed revealed that the group I had encountered was part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in carjacking and kidnapping along major interstate corridors throughout Texas and surrounding states. They had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting vulnerable travelers, using multiple vehicles and communication equipment to coordinate their attacks and avoid detection by law enforcement. Several arrests were made in connection with this organization over the following months, and investigators found evidence linking them to dozens of similar incidents involving lone travelers who had been followed, threatened, or attacked at rest areas throughout the region. My report had provided crucial information that helped law enforcement understand their operational methods and develop strategies for preventing future incidents. That dawn departure had seemed like such a logical way to avoid traffic and arrive safely at my destination. But it had actually made me more vulnerable to predators who understood that early morning. Travelers were often alone and carrying their most valuable possessions. The empty highways I had hoped would provide peaceful driving conditions had also provided perfect hunting grounds for criminals who relied on isolation and surprise to overwhelm their victims. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are confronting a new realm of fear with 8 of the most disturbing true home alone horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not urban legends or recycled narratives. They are painstakingly compiled from genuine reports and first-hand submissions, retold with utmost respect for the harrowing experiences behind them. Each tale unfurls a unique nightmare, from uninvited stalkers to silent intruders hidden in the walls, reminding us that the terror of isolation sometimes arises from real and lurking threats. While some names and identifying details have been modified to safeguard those who survived these ordeals, the authenticity and gravity of what transpired remains completely intact. If you value real horror from the dark corners of true life, you are in the right place. Be sure to subscribe to Buried Files for more in-depth accounts that will haunt your nights, and activate notifications so you never miss when the unknown comes knocking. My name is Marcus Johnson, and what I am about to share happened during my junior year at Arizona State University. I had been living in a rental house near campus with 2 roommates, but when winter break arrived in December, they both went home to their families while I stayed behind to work at a local restaurant. The extra shifts meant good money, and honestly, I welcomed the quiet after months of constant noise and chaos. The house was a typical college rental, a 2-story place built in the 1970s with a finished basement that we used as a hangout space. It had wood paneling, old carpet, and a separate entrance that led directly outside through metal storm doors. We rarely locked those basement doors since we figured nobody would want to steal our beat-up furniture and gaming consoles. For the first few days alone, everything felt normal. I would wake up, grab breakfast, head to work, and return home to an empty house. The silence was actually refreshing. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing small things that did not quite make sense. My milk carton, which had been nearly full when I left for my shift, was almost empty when I returned home. I blamed it on my poor memory. Maybe I had been drinking more than I realized. Then my leftover pizza disappeared from the refrigerator. Again, I convinced myself that I must have eaten it late one night and forgotten. The missing food bothered me, but I tried to rationalize it away. College life had trained me to assume that everything had a logical explanation, even when it did not feel right. I started writing down what food I had before leaving for work just to keep track. Sure enough, items kept vanishing. A half loaf of bread gone, an entire container of deli turkey missing, crackers disappearing from the pantry. The pattern was consistent. Someone was taking just enough to eat, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Whoever was doing this knew how to avoid detection. I began to suspect that one of my roommates had returned early and was playing some kind of elaborate prank. I searched their rooms looking for signs that they had come back without telling me, but everything remained exactly as they had left it. Their beds were still unmade, their belongings undisturbed. That was when I started paying attention to other details around the house. The basement television had been left on one morning when I was certain I had turned it off the night before. The couch cushions were arranged differently than how I remembered them. Small changes that could easily be dismissed as forgetfulness. But the accumulation was becoming impossible to ignore. I decided to test my theory. Before leaving for work one Thursday morning, I carefully arranged items in the basement in specific ways. A magazine placed at an exact angle on the coffee table, couch pillows positioned precisely, the television remote set in an unusual spot. When I returned that evening, everything had been moved. The magazine was on the floor, the pillows were bunched up as if someone had been sleeping on them. The remote was on the opposite side of the room. Someone had definitely been in my house while I was gone, and they were making themselves comfortable in the basement. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I tell them? That my food was disappearing and my furniture was moving? They would think I was paranoid or making things up. I needed more concrete proof before involving authorities. Instead, I decided to set up my own surveillance system. I positioned my laptop in the basement with its camera facing the main living area and set it to record while I was at work. The battery would not last all day, but it might capture something useful. The next evening, I rushed home and immediately checked the recording. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The basement remained empty and still. But then, at the 3-hour mark, I watched in absolute horror as the basement door opened and a man emerged from behind the water heater. He was middle-aged, wearing dirty clothes that looked like they had not been changed in weeks. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. He walked to the couch, sat down, and turned on the television as if he owned the place. I watched in stunned silence as this stranger ate my food, used my bathroom, and made himself completely at home. He had clearly been living in my basement for an unknown amount of time, hiding behind the water heater during the day and emerging when I was gone. The water heater area was in a dark corner that we never accessed, hidden behind some old boxes and holiday decorations. The recording showed him staying active for several hours before disappearing back behind the water heater. He knew my schedule. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I would return. This had been going on for who knows how long, and I had been completely oblivious. My hands shook as I called 911. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but when I explained that I had video evidence of someone living in my basement without permission, she took me seriously. Police arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed them the recording. 4 officers searched the house while I waited outside. They found his makeshift living space behind the water heater, a sleeping bag, bottles of water, and containers for human waste. He had created a small but functional living area in the darkest corner of the basement, complete with stolen food items and personal belongings that I had assumed were lost or misplaced over the months. The man was not there when they searched, but they found evidence that he had been coming and going through the basement storm doors, which had a broken lock that we had never bothered to fix. He had probably been watching the house for weeks before moving in, learning our routines and finding the perfect hiding spot. Officers told me that this was more common than people realized. Empty or partially occupied homes near college campuses were frequent targets for transients looking for temporary shelter. They often chose basements, attics, or other rarely used spaces where they could hide during the day and move around when residents were gone. The police set up surveillance and caught him 2 days later when he returned to collect his belongings. He had been living in my basement for over 6 weeks, surviving on stolen food and using our utilities. During questioning, he admitted that he had been in the house even when my roommates were there. But it was much easier to move around freely when I was alone. What disturbed me most was learning that he had been watching me sleep. He knew my schedule so well because he had been observing me for weeks, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, and when I left for work. He had complete access to the house and had been moving through it silently while I was unconscious upstairs. The man was arrested for breaking and entering, burglary, and criminal trespass. He had a history of similar incidents and had been homeless for several years. The police explained that he probably chose our house because it looked like a typical college rental. Easy access, minimal security, and residents who were often away. I could not sleep in that house for weeks afterward. Every sound made me wonder if someone else was hiding somewhere, waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. We installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensors throughout the house. I checked behind that water heater obsessively even though I knew it was empty. My roommates returned from break to find the house transformed into a fortress. When I explained what had happened, they were horrified but also fascinated. They wanted to see the video and hear every detail about how someone had been living with us without our knowledge. The story spread quickly through our friend group and became legendary on campus, but for me it was not an interesting story to share at parties. It was a fundamental violation of safety and security that changed how I viewed private spaces forever. The idea that someone can secretly share your home, watch your routines, and live off your resources without detection is terrifying in a way that few people truly understand unless they have experienced it. Even now, years later, I still check behind water heaters and in dark corners whenever I move to a new place. I secure every possible entry point and remain hyper-vigilant about unexplained changes in my environment. That experience taught me that home invasion does not always involve broken windows or kicked-in doors. Sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones you never know are there. The basement tenant had been my unwelcome roommate for over a month, and if I had not started paying attention to the small details, he might have continued living there indefinitely. That realization still gives me chills, knowing that someone was sharing my space, breathing the same air, and watching my life unfold from the shadows. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I am a single mother living in Tampa, Florida. What happened to me 3 months ago still makes me question everything I thought I knew about safety and technology. It was a Tuesday night in June when Hurricane Debbie was approaching the coast, bringing with it the kind of electrical storms that turn the sky into a war zone. My daughter Sophia was only 8 months old at the time, and like most new mothers, I had become obsessed with monitoring her sleep. I had installed one of those high-tech baby monitors with video and audio capabilities, the kind that connects to your phone and promises to give you peace of mind. The base unit sat on Sophia's dresser, and I kept the handheld receiver with me wherever I went in the house. That particular evening, the storm had knocked out power to half the neighborhood, but our house still had electricity. The wind was howling outside and rain pelted against the windows with such force that I worried the glass might crack. Sophia had been fussy all day because of the atmospheric pressure, but she had finally fallen asleep around 8 o'clock. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the baby monitor started acting strangely. Instead of the usual soft static or gentle breathing sounds from Sophia's room, I began hearing what sounded like fragments of conversation. At first, I assumed it was interference from other electronic devices in the neighborhood, something that occasionally happened during storms. The voices were faint and distorted, cutting in and out with the static. I could not make out specific words, but there seemed to be at least 2 people talking back and forth. I walked closer to Sophia's room to check if the sounds were actually coming from there, but when I peeked inside, she was sleeping peacefully. The voices were definitely coming through the monitor, not from the room itself. I tried adjusting the frequency settings, thinking maybe the device was picking up radio transmissions or signals from another baby monitor in the area. But as I fiddled with the controls, the voices became clearer, and what I heard made my blood run cold. A man's voice said, "She put the baby down about 20 minutes ago." Then a second voice, also male, replied, "Good. Give it another hour before we make our move." I stood frozen in my kitchen, gripping the monitor so tightly that my knuckles turned white. These were not random radio signals or crossed wires from another family's baby monitor. These people were talking about me and Sophia, and they seemed to know our schedule with frightening accuracy. The conversation continued sporadically over the next few minutes, always with the same two voices discussing details about our house and routine. They mentioned that I usually went to bed around 10:30 and that I always checked on Sophia one last time before turning off the lights. They knew which rooms had windows facing the street and which ones were hidden from view. My first instinct was to call 911, but I hesitated because I knew how crazy it would sound. What would I tell them? That my baby monitor was picking up voices of people planning to break into my house? They would probably assume I was having some kind of postpartum anxiety episode or that the storm was making me paranoid. Instead, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my phone and started recording the audio from the baby monitor, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The voices came and went with the static, but I managed to record several minutes of clear conversation. "The back door looks like the easiest entry point," one voice said. "No deadbolt, just a regular handle lock." "What about the dog?" the second voice asked. "There is no dog. I've been watching for 3 days. Just her and the baby." My legs nearly gave out when I heard that. Someone had been watching my house for 3 days, studying our routines and planning some kind of break-in. The detail about the back door was particularly terrifying because it was accurate. I had been meaning to install a deadbolt but had not gotten around to it yet. I crept through the house, turning off all the lights and checking every window and door to make sure they were locked. My hands shook as I drew all the curtains and blinds, suddenly aware of how exposed I had been living. If someone had been watching us for 3 days, they had seen everything. When I fed Sophia, when I did laundry, when I took showers. The storm outside was getting worse, with thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Each flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second, and I found myself scanning for signs of movement or unusual shadows. But the real terror was coming through that baby monitor, which continued to broadcast fragments of conversation throughout the evening. Around 9:30, I heard one of the voices say, "Lights are going out in the front rooms. She is getting ready for bed." I had indeed been turning off lights as I made my final rounds through the house, following my usual bedtime routine without realizing I was being observed. The fact that they could see into my house and coordinate their observations through some kind of radio communication was beyond frightening. I called my sister Maria, who lived about 15 minutes away, and asked her to come over. I could not explain everything over the phone without sounding completely insane, but I told her I was scared and needed someone to stay the night. She could hear the panic in my voice and agreed to drive over despite the storm. While waiting for Maria to arrive, I continued monitoring the radio transmissions. The voices discussed timing, entry methods, and what they were looking for once they got inside. They mentioned jewelry, electronics, and cash, making it clear that this was a planned burglary. But they also talked about making sure we did not wake up during the process, which implied they knew we would be home. "If she wakes up, we just tie her up until we are finished," one voice said casually. "The baby will not be a problem." That was the moment I realized these people were not just planning to rob my house. They were prepared to use violence if necessary. The casual way they discussed restraining me and dismissing Sophia as not a problem suggested they had done this before and knew how to handle complications. Maria arrived around 10:15, soaked from the rain and confused about why I had sounded so panicked on the phone. I showed her the baby monitor and played back some of the recordings I had captured on my phone. At first, she was skeptical, suggesting it might be interference from emergency services or utility workers dealing with storm damage. But as we listened together, more transmissions came through with specific details about our house and movements. The voices discussed which car was mine in the driveway, mentioned that a light was still on in the kitchen, and noted that a second person had arrived. "There is another car now," one voice observed. "Looks like she has company." "Should we wait?" the second voice asked. "No, stick to the plan. 2 women and a baby, we can handle it." Maria's face went white when she heard that. She immediately called 911 while I continued recording the transmissions. The police dispatcher took the call seriously, especially when Maria explained that we had audio recordings of people planning to break into the house that night. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes, and I played the recordings for the officers. They were initially puzzled by the baby monitor situation, but became very concerned when they heard the specific details about our house and the casual discussion of violence. The officers conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. Behind the trees at the back of my yard, they found 2 men in a pickup truck with radio equipment and binoculars. The men had been using short-range radios to communicate while conducting surveillance, and somehow their frequency had been picked up by my baby monitor's receiver. Both men were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit burglary, stalking, and possession of burglary tools. Their truck contained rope, duct tape, crowbars, and detailed notes about my daily routine. They had been watching the house for over a week, not 3 days, as they had mentioned on the radio. During questioning, police learned that this was part of a larger operation targeting single mothers in the area. The men would identify houses with young children, conduct surveillance to learn routines, and then break in when they believed the occupants would be asleep. They specifically chose homes where they thought resistance would be minimal. The baby monitor had saved our lives by accidentally intercepting their radio communications. If I had not heard those transmissions, they would have broken in around midnight and found us completely unprepared. The police said it was extremely unusual for baby monitors to pick up 2-way radio signals, but the storm conditions and their proximity to the house had created perfect circumstances for the interference. After that night, I could not sleep peacefully for months. Every sound from the baby monitor made me jump, wondering if I was hearing normal household noises or something more sinister. I installed a complete security system with cameras, motion sensors, and professional monitoring. I moved Sophia's crib into my bedroom and kept it there for weeks. The most disturbing part was realizing how vulnerable we had been without knowing it. These men had been watching us, learning our habits, and planning violence while I went about my normal routine completely unaware. The baby monitor that was supposed to help me protect Sophia had accidentally revealed how much danger we were really in. I still use baby monitors, but I have learned to pay attention to unusual sounds or interference. Technology can be both a shield and a window, protecting us from some dangers while accidentally revealing others. That storm brought more than just wind and rain. It brought the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The case went to trial 6 months later, and both men received significant prison sentences. But knowing they are locked up does not erase the memory of hearing strangers discuss breaking into my home and threatening my child. Some violations of safety and privacy leave permanent scars, changing how you view the world and your place in it forever. My name is Tyler Washington, and I work as a night security guard for a large office complex in Detroit, Michigan. Due to the pandemic, my company had transitioned to remote monitoring, which meant I could do most of my job from home using multiple computer screens and camera feeds. It was actually perfect for me. I could work nights while taking care of my elderly grandmother during the day, and the pay was decent enough to support both of us. Our house is a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood where most residents are elderly or working families. I had converted the basement into my home office, setting up multiple monitors to watch security feeds from various buildings downtown. The setup was impressive. 6 large screens showing different angles of lobbies, parking garages, and office floors that I monitored from midnight until 8 in the morning. My routine was consistent and methodical. I would start my shift at midnight, make coffee, and settle into my chair for 8 hours of surveillance. Every hour I would do a virtual patrol, checking each camera feed systematically and documenting anything unusual. Around 3 in the morning, I would take a 15-minute break to stretch my legs and grab a snack from the kitchen. At 6, I would make another cup of coffee to get through the final stretch. This routine had been working perfectly for almost a year when something started to feel wrong. It began 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night when I heard footsteps upstairs during my shift. At first, I assumed it was my grandmother getting up to use the bathroom, which happened occasionally despite her usually sleeping soundly through the night. But when I checked on her a few minutes later, she was fast asleep in her bed. The next night, I heard the same pattern of footsteps around the same time. Slow, deliberate walking from the kitchen to the living room, then back to the kitchen. Again, I found my grandmother sleeping peacefully when I investigated. I started to wonder if the house was settling or if I was hearing sounds from neighboring houses, but the footsteps were distinctly coming from directly above my basement office. By the end of that first week, the footsteps had become a nightly occurrence. They always happened around 2:30 in the morning, always followed the same path through the kitchen and living room, and always lasted about 5 minutes. But my grandmother was always asleep when I checked, and she never mentioned being up during the night. What made it truly disturbing was how closely the footsteps matched my own routine. I realized that the timing coincided exactly with when I would normally take my break and walk through the kitchen to get a snack. Someone upstairs was mimicking my movements, following the same path I took every night, but they were doing it while I was still in the basement. I started paying closer attention to other sounds in the house. The coffee maker would turn on at 3:15 every morning, which was when I typically made my second pot of coffee. But I had not turned it on. I would hear the familiar beep of the microwave around 4 o'clock, the exact time I usually heated up leftover dinner. Cabinet doors would open and close in the kitchen, following the pattern of my usual snack preparation. The most unnerving part was hearing my own routine being performed upstairs while I sat in the basement doing my job. It was like listening to a recording of my normal night, except I was not the one making those sounds. Someone else was moving through my house, opening my cabinets, using my appliances, and following my schedule with disturbing precision. I began documenting everything, writing down the exact times I heard footsteps, appliance sounds, and cabinet doors. The pattern was incredibly consistent. Every sound happened at the precise time I would normally make that movement or use that appliance. Whoever was in my house had been watching me long enough to memorize my entire routine. The footsteps were always the same weight and pace as my own. The coffee maker ran for exactly the same duration I typically used. Even the microwave would beep for the same number of times I usually set it for. This level of detail suggested someone had been observing me for weeks or months, learning every aspect of my nightly habits. I installed a security camera in the kitchen, angled to capture the main walking area where I heard most of the sounds. The first night with the camera, I watched my monitors while simultaneously listening to the familiar footstep pattern above me. But when I checked the kitchen camera feed, the room was completely empty. No movement, no person, nothing to explain the sounds I was clearly hearing. This continued for several more nights, hearing detailed activity upstairs while seeing absolutely nothing on the camera. I started to question my sanity, wondering if the isolation and night shift work were causing some kind of auditory hallucinations. But the sounds were too specific, too consistent, and too closely matched to my routine to be imaginary. I decided to test the situation by changing my routine slightly. Instead of taking my break at 3 in the morning, I waited until 3:30. The footsteps upstairs adjusted to match my new timing. When I made coffee at 3:45 instead of 3:15, I heard the coffee maker turn on upstairs at exactly 3:45. Whoever was in my house was not following a memorized schedule. They were actively watching me and mimicking my movements in real time. This meant they had visual access to my basement office and could see when I stood up, when I walked toward the stairs, and when I performed specific actions. I spent an entire night searching for hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment in the basement, but found nothing. The house had been thoroughly renovated before we moved in, with new electrical work and updated systems, so it seemed unlikely that someone had installed monitoring devices during construction. The breakthrough came when I decided to remain completely still during my usual break time. I sat in my chair, did not make coffee, did not go upstairs, and did not follow any part of my normal routine. For the first time in weeks, the house remained silent. No footsteps, no appliances, no cabinet doors. Whoever was upstairs was clearly responding to my actions, not following a predetermined script. I realized that someone had been living in my house, hiding somewhere during the day when my grandmother and I were active, and emerging at night to shadow my movements. They had learned my routine so perfectly that they could anticipate my actions and move through the house while staying just out of sight. The next night, I pretended to start my normal routine but stopped halfway through. I walked toward the stairs as if going to the kitchen, then quietly returned to my monitors. Within seconds, I heard footsteps upstairs moving toward the kitchen. Someone was definitely following me, staying one room ahead to avoid detection. I called the police and explained the situation, though I knew it sounded bizarre. 2 officers came to investigate and conducted a thorough search of the house. They found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space above the main floor ceiling, a small area accessible through the attic that provided a perfect hiding spot with visual access to most rooms through gaps in the old ceiling. The space contained blankets, food containers, and a small notebook filled with detailed observations about my grandmother's and my daily schedules. The notes included precise timing of when we slept, when we were out of the house, what we ate, and even personal conversations we had had in the kitchen. Someone had been watching and documenting our lives for months. They also found a small hole drilled in the basement ceiling that provided a clear view of my computer setup. This explained how the intruder could monitor my work routine and mimic my movements with such accuracy. They had been watching me work every night, learning my habits, and then performing a shadow version of my routine in the rooms above. The intruder was never caught, but evidence suggested they had been accessing the house through a loose attic vent that connected to the roof. They probably entered during the day when we were both occupied and hid in the crawl space until nighttime. The setup was sophisticated and suggested someone with construction knowledge who understood how to move through houses without detection. We installed proper security throughout the house, sealed all potential entry points, and added motion sensors in areas that had previously been unmonitored. My grandmother was shaken by the revelation that someone had been living above her bedroom for months, watching her sleep and documenting her routine. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that this person had no interest in stealing anything or causing immediate harm. They seemed content to observe, document, and mimic our lives while remaining hidden. The notebook contained months of detailed observations about our habits, preferences, and schedules, suggesting a level of obsession that went far beyond typical breaking and entering. I eventually had to change jobs because I could not focus on security monitoring while worrying about who might be watching me. Every sound in the house made me wonder if someone was hiding nearby. Learning my new routine and preparing to begin their shadow performance again. The violation of having someone secretly live in your home, watching your most private moments, changes your relationship with safety and privacy permanently. Even now, in a different house with better security, I still listen carefully during my breaks, wondering if those familiar footsteps might return to echo my movements from somewhere just out of sight. My name is Sofia Martinez, and I am an art student from the University of New Mexico. Last September, I rented a small cabin in the mountains outside Albuquerque for a month-long independent study project. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my painting, but it also made me the perfect target for someone with very disturbing intentions. The cabin was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, nestled in a grove of pine trees with large windows that provided beautiful natural light for my artwork. It was a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a spacious living area that I had converted into my studio space. The owner was an elderly woman who lived in Santa Fe and rented the property to artists and writers seeking creative solitude. I had been there for about a week when I first noticed that something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched that I initially attributed to the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, especially when I was working near the large windows that faced the forest. The cabin had windows on all sides, and I loved the feeling of being surrounded by nature while I painted. During the day, I kept most of the curtains open to maximize the natural light. But at night, those same windows became sources of anxiety. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks before going to bed. About 10 days into my stay, I discovered the first piece of evidence that my unease was justified. While walking around the cabin one morning to stretch my legs, I noticed footprints in the soft soil beneath the living room windows. They were clearly fresh, made sometime during the night when the ground was still damp from an evening rain shower. The prints were from men's boots, size 10 or 11, and they formed a pattern that suggested someone had been standing at the window for an extended period. There were deeper impressions where the person had shifted their weight, indicating they had remained in that spot for quite some time. The positioning of the prints showed that whoever made them had been looking directly into my improvised studio where I spent most of my time. I called the property owner, Mrs. Gutierrez, to report the footprints, but she seemed unconcerned. She suggested it might have been a maintenance worker checking on the property, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for help. Her casual dismissal made me question whether I was overreacting, but the footprints were definitely deliberate and purposeful, not the random marks of someone passing by. That night, I made sure all curtains were tightly closed before settling into work. But around 11 o'clock, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the direction of the kitchen window. It was rhythmic and gentle, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. When I crept toward the kitchen to investigate, the tapping stopped immediately. I stood in the darkened kitchen for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing more. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through a gap in the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of trees. But the timing was too perfect. The tapping had stopped the exact moment I approached the window, suggesting that whoever was outside could see my movements inside the cabin. The next day brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. While taking my morning walk around the property, I found a small digital camera partially hidden in the bushes near the bedroom window. It was camouflaged with green tape and positioned to capture a clear view of the room where I slept. The camera was still recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily. My hands shook as I examined the device. It was a trail camera, the type used by hunters to monitor wildlife, but it had been modified and carefully positioned to spy on the cabin. The angle and placement showed that whoever put it there had intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout and my daily routines. They knew which room I slept in and had positioned the camera for maximum surveillance. I immediately called the sheriff's department, and Deputy Rodriguez arrived within an hour. He took the camera as evidence and conducted a thorough search of the property. We found 2 more cameras, one near the living room window where I did my painting, and another positioned to monitor the front entrance and my car. The cameras had been recording for at least a week, capturing footage of me arriving, unpacking, setting up my studio, and going about my daily routine. Deputy Rodriguez explained that this level of surveillance suggested someone was not just randomly spying, but was specifically targeting me and studying my habits for some unknown purpose. The most disturbing discovery came when we examined the memory cards from the cameras. They contained hours of footage showing me working, sleeping, cooking, and moving through the cabin completely unaware that I was being watched. But there were also videos taken from inside the cabin showing that someone had been entering the property while I was away. The interior footage showed a man in his 40s wearing dark clothing and gloves moving through my living space with disturbing familiarity. He went through my belongings, examined my paintings, and spent considerable time looking through my personal items. In one video, he was sitting on my bed holding one of my sweaters and bringing it to his face. Deputy Rodriguez identified the man as someone with a history of stalking and breaking into properties rented by young women. His name was David Kellerman, and he had been arrested twice before for similar behavior in Colorado and Arizona. He specifically targeted isolated rental properties where single women stayed alone, using surveillance equipment to study their routines before escalating to break-ins. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been watching the cabin for weeks before I arrived, waiting for the right tenant. He had somehow gained access to the rental listings and specifically chose properties rented by young women who would be staying alone for extended periods. My artist residency made me a perfect target because he knew I would be isolated and focused on my work. Police found his campsite about half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a dense area of forest. He had been living there for over a month, equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, camping gear, and detailed notes about my daily activities. His notebook contained my schedule, descriptions of my appearance, and disturbing personal observations about my habits and preferences. The campsite also contained photographs that he had taken of me through the cabin windows, printed on a portable printer. Some were taken during the day while I was painting, others at night when I was getting ready for bed. The photos were organized chronologically and included written comments about my appearance and activities that made it clear this was not random voyeurism, but an obsessive fixation. Kellerman was arrested 2 days later at a gas station in town where he was purchasing supplies. The police found additional surveillance equipment in his truck, along with cable ties, duct tape, and other items that suggested his intentions went far beyond simple observation. Deputy Rodriguez told me that based on the evidence, they believed he was planning to eventually approach or confront me directly. During questioning, Kellerman admitted to stalking multiple women in similar situations over the past 5 years. He would identify isolated rental properties, conduct surveillance for weeks, and then escalate to breaking in and spending time in their living spaces while they were away. In some cases, he had been living in or near rental properties simultaneously with his victims for weeks without their knowledge. The psychological evaluation revealed that Kellerman was obsessed with the idea of sharing living spaces with women without their consent. He derived satisfaction from being close to them, learning their habits, and infiltrating their private lives while remaining undetected. The cameras allowed him to feel connected to his victims even when he was not physically present. I had to cut my residency short and return to Albuquerque, but the experience left me with lasting trauma that affected my ability to work alone or stay in isolated locations. The knowledge that someone had been watching me sleep, documenting my movements, and entering my living space while I was gone created a violation of privacy that took months of therapy to address. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Kellerman was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stalking, breaking and entering, and violation of privacy. But knowing he is locked up does not erase the memory of seeing those photographs of myself taken without my knowledge, or the realization that someone had been sharing my living space and studying my life with such obsessive detail. Mrs. Gutierrez installed comprehensive security systems at the cabin and now screens tenants more carefully. But she told me that the experience made her reconsider renting to single women staying alone. The isolation that makes these properties attractive to artists and writers also makes them ideal hunting grounds for predators who know how to exploit vulnerability and privacy. I still paint, but I no longer work near large windows or stay in isolated locations alone. The art that was supposed to come from solitude and natural beauty instead came from the terrifying knowledge that privacy is often just an illusion, and that the most dangerous watchers are the ones you never know are there. My name is Jackson Miller, and I am 17 years old from Burlington, Vermont. What happened to me last fall during my uncle's business trip still makes me question how well we really know the people we trust. I was house sitting for my Uncle David, who lives in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from where my parents and I live. He had asked me to stay at his place for 2 weeks while he traveled to Europe for work, taking care of his elderly cat and making sure the house looked occupied. Uncle David lived alone in a modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, surrounded by families who had been neighbors for years. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, borrowed lawnmowers, and looked out for one another. Before leaving, my uncle introduced me to several neighbors and gave them my phone number in case any problems arose while he was away. The most helpful of these neighbors was Mr. Peterson, a man in his 50s who lived 3 houses down. He worked from home as some kind of consultant and seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Uncle David told me that Mr. Peterson was incredibly reliable and had helped with various house projects over the years. He had a key to the house for emergencies and had offered to check on me periodically while I was staying there alone. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I attended school during the day and returned to Uncle David's house in the evening to do homework, feed the cat, and maintain my normal routine. Mr. Peterson stopped by twice during that first week, once to bring me some homemade cookies from his wife and another time to check that the heating system was working properly. I appreciated his attention and kindness, especially since I was still adjusting to sleeping in an unfamiliar house. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and made sure I had his phone number in case I needed anything. He mentioned several times that I should not hesitate to call him, even in the middle of the night, if anything seemed wrong or if I felt unsafe. By the end of the first week, Mr. Peterson's visits had become a daily occurrence. He would stop by every evening around 6 o'clock, always with some practical reason. Checking the mail, inspecting the exterior lights, or bringing me food that his wife had prepared. While I was grateful for the attention, I started to notice that his visits were lasting longer, and that he seemed particularly interested in my daily schedule. He would ask detailed questions about my school hours, what time I usually got home, whether I had plans for the weekend and if any friends or family members were planning to visit. At first, I assumed he was just being thorough about neighborhood security, but gradually I realized that his questions were more specific than necessary for simple safety concerns. Mr. Peterson also began commenting on things that suggested he had been observing the house more closely than I had realized. He mentioned noticing that I kept late hours on weekends, that I had been watching television in the living room until nearly midnight, and that I had received several packages during the week. These observations required more surveillance than casual neighborly attention. The situation became genuinely unsettling when Mr. Peterson started letting himself into the house without knocking. He would use his emergency key and appear in the kitchen while I was doing homework or watching television, always with some excuse about checking on the furnace or investigating a strange noise he had heard. The first few times I accepted his explanations, but the frequency and timing of these unannounced visits made me increasingly uncomfortable. What disturbed me most was that Mr. Peterson always seemed to know exactly when I was home alone and when I would be arriving from school. He would appear within minutes of my return from school or emerge from somewhere in the house just as I was settling in for the evening. This level of timing suggested that he was monitoring my movements much more closely than appropriate. I started paying attention to Mr. Peterson's behavior and noticed details that should have alarmed me earlier. He knew which lights I typically turned on in the evenings, what I usually ate for dinner, what television programs I watched, and even what time I usually went to bed. This knowledge required observation that went far beyond casual neighborly interest. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicion by varying my routine. Instead of coming straight home from school, I went to the library and stayed until nearly 8 o'clock. When I finally arrived at Uncle David's house, Mr. Peterson was waiting in his driveway and immediately approached me, asking why I was so late and whether everything was all right. His concern seemed excessive for someone who was simply watching out for me, and his knowledge of my usual schedule was too precise to be casual observation. I realized that Mr. Peterson had been tracking my daily movements with an attention to detail that crossed the line from helpful neighbor to something much more concerning. The breakthrough came when I found evidence that Mr. Peterson had been entering the house regularly when I was at school. I had started leaving small objects in specific positions before leaving in the morning. A book placed at a particular angle, a coffee cup positioned precisely on the counter, a magazine folded to a specific page. Each day, these items had been moved slightly, indicating that someone was spending time in the house while I was away. I also discovered that food was disappearing from the refrigerator in small amounts, and that the television was warm when I returned home, suggesting it had been used during the day. Someone was clearly making themselves comfortable in the house while I was at school, and Mr. Peterson was the only person with a key and detailed knowledge of my schedule. The most disturbing discovery came when I found a notebook hidden in the basement that contained detailed observations about my daily routine, personal habits, and even physical descriptions of my appearance and behavior. The handwriting was not Uncle David's, and the observations were far too detailed and personal to be innocent neighborhood watch activities. The notebook contained entries spanning several weeks, including dates before I had even arrived to house sit. This meant that whoever was writing these observations had been planning something involving me for quite some time. The entries included comments about my vulnerability, my isolation from family, and speculation about my personal relationships that made it clear this was not innocent surveillance. I called my parents immediately and explained the situation. They drove over that night and helped me search the house more thoroughly. We found additional evidence that someone had been using the house regularly, including personal items that did not belong to Uncle David and modifications to the basement that created a small living space behind the furnace. When we called the police, they took the situation very seriously. Detective Williams explained that using emergency access to enter someone's home for unauthorized surveillance was a serious crime, especially when it involved monitoring a minor. The notebook provided clear evidence of stalking behavior that had escalated to the point of illegal entry and invasion of privacy. The police arrested Mr. Peterson the next morning when they found him in Uncle David's house while I was at school. He had been using his emergency key to enter the property daily, sometimes spending several hours inside while I was away. He had created a comfortable setup in the basement where he could monitor my activities and document his observations about my routine and behavior. During questioning, Mr. Peterson admitted that he had been planning this surveillance for months, waiting for an opportunity when Uncle David would be away and I would be staying alone. He had volunteered to be the neighborhood contact specifically so he could gain access to the house and monitor me without suspicion. His helpful neighbor persona was entirely calculated to gain trust and access. The investigation revealed that Mr. Peterson had a history of similar behavior involving other young people in previous neighborhoods. He would identify vulnerable situations where teenagers were staying alone and position himself as a helpful adult figure while secretly conducting surveillance and documenting their personal lives. In 2 previous cases, his behavior had escalated to physical confrontation when his victims had become suspicious. Mr. Peterson was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The case went to trial 8 months later and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone I trusted had been secretly living in the house and monitoring my every move took much longer to process. Uncle David was devastated to learn that someone he had trusted with his home and my safety had been using that trust to prey on me. He installed a complete security system and changed all the locks, but he also struggled with the guilt of having unknowingly facilitated the surveillance by providing access and legitimacy to someone with dangerous intentions. The experience taught me that predators often use positions of trust and authority to gain access to their victims. Mr. Peterson's Helpful Neighbor Act was perfectly designed to deflect suspicion while providing unlimited access to monitor and document my personal life. The most dangerous people are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, because their position makes it difficult to question their motives until the behavior becomes undeniably inappropriate. Even now, I am suspicious of adults who seem overly interested in my schedule or who position themselves as helpful figures without clear reasons for their attention. That false sense of security and trust can be more dangerous than obvious threats because it prevents victims from recognizing danger until the situation has already escalated beyond appropriate boundaries. My name is Avery Thompson, and I work remotely from my apartment in Boise, Idaho as a graphic designer. The flexibility of working from home has always been one of my favorite aspects of my job. But what happened to me last month made me realize how that routine can make you vulnerable to people with dangerous intentions. I live alone in a ground-floor apartment in a quiet complex near the University District. The building has about 20 units and most residents are either graduate students or young professionals like myself. The complex has a secure entry system, but delivery drivers are typically buzzed in without much scrutiny, especially during the day when most people are expecting packages. My work involves frequent online orders, art supplies, computer equipment, and various materials for client projects. I probably receive packages 3 or 4 times a week, which has become such a normal part of my routine that I barely pay attention to delivery schedules anymore. Most drivers just leave packages outside my door with a quick knock or ring of the doorbell. 3 weeks ago, I noticed that my deliveries were becoming more frequent and coming at unusual times. I would find packages on my doorstep that I had not ordered, usually small items like office supplies or household goods. At first, I assumed there was some mix-up with addresses or that my upstairs neighbor was having items delivered to the wrong unit. The packages were always addressed to me, though, with my correct name and apartment number. When I checked my credit card statements and online accounts, I could not find any record of having ordered these items. I called a few of the shipping companies to report the error, but they insisted the items had been legitimately ordered from my address using valid payment information. After about a week of mysterious deliveries, I decided to stay home one day and watch for the delivery driver to see if I could figure out what was happening. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my doorbell rang and I immediately went to answer it. Standing outside was a man in a delivery uniform holding a small package. He was in his 30s, average height, with dark hair and an overly friendly demeanor that seemed forced. When I opened the door, he smiled broadly and said he had been making deliveries to my apartment for several weeks and wanted to make sure I was satisfied with the service. He asked detailed questions about my work schedule, whether I was usually home during the day, and if I lived alone. The questions felt intrusive, but I assumed he was just being thorough about delivery logistics. I mentioned that I worked from home most days and that packages could be left outside my door if I was not available to answer. He seemed pleased by this information and lingered outside my apartment for several more minutes, making small talk about the neighborhood and complimenting my apartment's location. After he left, I realized that legitimate delivery drivers rarely have extended conversations with recipients or ask personal questions about living situations. His interest in my schedule and living arrangements seemed excessive for someone just delivering packages. I also noticed that he had been looking past me into my apartment while we talked, scanning the interior as if assessing the layout. Over the next few days, the mysterious packages continued arriving. But now I paid closer attention to the delivery process. I noticed that the same driver was making all the deliveries, even though the packages came from different companies that should have been using different shipping services. This suggested that someone was specifically arranging for the same person to have repeated access to my building and apartment. I started keeping track of delivery times and noticed they were becoming more frequent and occurring at specific times when I had previously mentioned being home. If I had told him I usually took lunch breaks around noon, packages would arrive right around 12 o'clock. If I had mentioned working late on certain projects, deliveries would come in the evening hours. The breakthrough came when I decided to install a small security camera near my door to monitor delivery activity. The first day with the camera, I captured footage that made my blood run cold. The delivery driver was not just dropping off packages and leaving. He was using some kind of tool to manipulate my door lock and spending several minutes inside my apartment while I was out. The video showed him entering my apartment, walking through the rooms and examining my personal belongings with disturbing familiarity. He went through my desk drawers, looked at photographs, and spent considerable time in my bedroom, opening closets and examining clothing. He was clearly using the delivery visits as opportunities to case my apartment and learn about my personal life. I immediately called the police and showed them the security footage. Detective Morrison took the case very seriously and explained that using delivery services to gain access to homes was an increasingly common tactic used by burglars and stalkers. The fake packages provided legitimate cover for repeated visits and allowed the perpetrator to study potential victims and their routines. The investigation revealed that the man was not actually employed by any of the shipping companies whose uniforms he wore. His name was Robert Chen, and he had been purchasing delivery uniforms online and creating fake packages to gain access to apartment complexes throughout the city. He specifically targeted young women who lived alone and worked from home. Police found his apartment filled with stolen items from dozens of homes, photographs of women taken without their knowledge, and detailed notes about the daily routines of potential victims. He had been conducting this scheme for over a year, using fake deliveries to identify vulnerable targets. and then escalating to burglary or worse. Chen's notes about me were particularly disturbing. He had documented my work schedule, social activities, and even personal habits like what I typically wore around the apartment. He knew when I usually showered, when I ordered food, and when I was most likely to be distracted by work projects. He had been planning something much more serious than simple burglary. The investigation revealed that Chen had a history of sexual assault charges in another state and had been using the delivery scheme to identify and monitor potential victims. Several other women came forward after his arrest, reporting similar experiences with mysterious packages and overly friendly delivery drivers who asked too many personal questions. Chen had been using the fake deliveries to gradually desensitize victims to his presence and gather information about their vulnerabilities. The packages created a sense of routine and familiarity that made his frequent visits seem normal and legitimate. By the time victims became suspicious, he already had detailed knowledge of their homes and schedules. The most disturbing aspect was learning that Chen had been planning to escalate his behavior. Police found detailed plans for home invasions, including information about which victims would be easiest to overpower and which apartments provided the best opportunities for assault without detection. My security camera had likely prevented a much more serious crime. Chen was arrested and charged with burglary, stalking, identity theft, and possession of stolen property. During the investigation, police linked him to over 30 similar cases across 3 states. He had been using the fake delivery scheme to commit crimes for several years, always moving to new areas when local police began investigating suspicious delivery patterns. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Chen was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone had been systematically infiltrating my personal space and planning to assault me was devastating. I had to move to a different apartment and completely change my work routine and online ordering habits. I now verify all deliveries before accepting packages, require identification from all delivery personnel, and never provide personal information about my schedule or living situation to strangers. I also installed comprehensive security equipment and changed my delivery address to a secure pickup location rather than having items sent directly to my home. The experience taught me that predators are constantly evolving their tactics to exploit new vulnerabilities created by modern conveniences. The rise of online shopping and frequent deliveries has created opportunities for criminals to gain legitimate access to private spaces while appearing to provide normal services. What made Chen's scheme so effective was that delivery drivers are expected to be in residential areas, asking about schedules and having access to buildings and apartments. His fake packages provided perfect cover for surveillance and infiltration activities that would otherwise be obviously suspicious. Even now, I feel anxious whenever my doorbell rings unexpectedly or when delivery drivers ask questions beyond basic logistics. The violation of having someone systematically infiltrate my personal space while pretending to provide a service has permanently changed how I interact with strangers and how much personal information I share in casual conversations. The case highlighted how criminals are adapting to exploit the trust and convenience that modern life depends on, turning everyday interactions into opportunities for predatory behavior that can escalate to serious violence. My name is Dakota Kim, and I am a 20-year-old college student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. What happened to me last spring during my recovery from ACL surgery still haunts me and has completely changed how I view healthcare workers and the trust we place in people who enter our homes during vulnerable times. I had torn my ACL playing intramural soccer in February, requiring reconstructive surgery that left me bedridden for several weeks with limited mobility. My parents lived in California, so they arranged for a home health aide through a reputable medical agency to help me with daily tasks while I recovered in my off-campus apartment near the university. The apartment was a small one-bedroom place that I normally shared with my roommate Jessica, but she had moved out temporarily to do an internship in Atlanta. This meant I would be alone with whatever healthcare worker the agency assigned to me, which made my parents nervous but seemed necessary given my limited mobility and the pain medication that left me drowsy and disoriented. The agency sent someone named Marcus Williams, a man in his early 30s who had excellent credentials and references from previous clients. He was professional during our initial meeting, explaining his experience with post-surgical care and outlining a schedule for helping me with meals, medication management, and physical therapy exercises. He seemed competent and caring, which put both my parents and me at ease. For the first week, Marcus followed his schedule perfectly. He would arrive at 8 in the morning, help me shower and get dressed, prepare meals, assist with my physical therapy routine, and handle household tasks that I could not manage on crutches. He was professional, respectful of my privacy, and genuinely seemed invested in helping me recover quickly. The arrangement was supposed to last for 3 weeks until I could manage independently, but by the second week, Marcus began suggesting changes to the schedule that made me uncomfortable. He proposed staying overnight so he could monitor my pain levels and help if I needed assistance during the night. When I declined, he insisted that his other clients always appreciated having 24-hour care. Marcus also began asking increasingly personal questions about my social life, relationships, and family finances. He wanted to know if I had a boyfriend who might visit, whether my parents planned to check on me, and how much money I had access to for medical expenses. These questions seemed excessive for someone providing basic healthcare assistance. By the third week, Marcus had established a pattern of arriving earlier than scheduled and staying later than necessary. He would let himself in using the key I had given him and often be in my apartment when I woke up, claiming he wanted to check on me during the night. When I expressed discomfort with this arrangement, he assured me it was standard procedure for patients on strong pain medication. The situation became genuinely alarming when I discovered that Marcus had been going through my personal belongings while I slept. I found my laptop moved to different locations, dresser drawers slightly open, and personal documents that had been disturbed. When I confronted him about this, he claimed he was looking for my medication schedule and insurance information to better coordinate my care. Marcus also began making comments about my appearance and recovery that crossed professional boundaries. He would compliment my body during physical therapy sessions, make suggestive remarks about helping me bathe, and ask detailed questions about my intimate relationships that had no relevance to my medical care. When I tried to redirect these conversations, he would claim he was just being friendly and trying to keep my spirits up. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to find Marcus sitting in my bedroom chair watching me sleep. He claimed he was checking on my breathing and pain levels, but when I asked him to leave, he became defensive and insisted that monitoring patients during sleep was part of his job responsibilities. His presence in my bedroom at 3 in the morning felt predatory and inappropriate. I called the home health agency the next morning to request a different aide, but Marcus intercepted the call, taking the phone from me and speaking to his supervisor privately. He told me afterward that the agency was satisfied with his care and that changing aides mid-treatment would disrupt my recovery progress. He also mentioned that filing complaints could affect my insurance coverage and delay my return to school. That afternoon, while Marcus was supposedly running errands, I called the agency directly from my cell phone. The supervisor I spoke with had no record of Marcus calling them and seemed surprised by my description of his behavior. When I detailed his overnight stays, personal questions, and invasive monitoring, she immediately expressed concern and said this was not standard protocol for their aides. The supervisor explained that Marcus was only authorized to provide daytime care and should never have been staying overnight or accessing my apartment outside of scheduled hours. She also confirmed that going through patients' personal belongings and making inappropriate comments were serious violations of their professional standards. She promised to investigate immediately and send a replacement aide within 24 hours. When Marcus returned that evening, I told him that the agency was sending someone else to complete my care. His reaction was immediate and frightening. He became angry, defensive, and insisted that I was overreacting to normal healthcare procedures. He claimed that all his previous clients had been grateful for his dedicated attention and that I was being ungrateful for the extra care he provided. Marcus refused to leave my apartment that night, claiming he needed to properly transition my care to the new aide and that abandoning a patient mid-treatment would be irresponsible. When I insisted he leave, he became increasingly agitated and began making veiled threats about my safety and recovery. He implied that without his protection, I was vulnerable to break-ins or accidents. I managed to call 911 while Marcus was in the bathroom, and 2 police officers arrived within 15 minutes. When they asked Marcus to explain his presence in my apartment after being dismissed, he claimed there had been a misunderstanding and that he was still officially assigned to my case. However, when the officers called the agency, they confirmed that Marcus had been immediately suspended pending investigation. The police escorted Marcus from my apartment, but he returned 2 hours later using the key I had forgotten to retrieve from him. I was awakened by sounds in the kitchen and found him preparing food, claiming he was concerned about my nutrition and wanted to make sure I ate properly. The officers had to return and arrest him for criminal trespass in violation of a no-contact order. The investigation revealed that Marcus had a history of inappropriate behavior with female clients that the agency had either overlooked or inadequately investigated. 3 previous clients had filed complaints about boundary violations, unauthorized overnight stays, and invasive questioning, but Marcus had managed to explain away each incident as misunderstandings or necessary medical care. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been photographing me while I slept and documenting personal details about my living situation, finances, and social connections. Police found his phone contained dozens of photos taken in my apartment without my knowledge, along with detailed notes about my daily routine, medication schedule, and periods of vulnerability. Marcus was charged with stalking, criminal trespass, invasion of privacy, and violation of professional standards. The Home Health Agency faced additional scrutiny for inadequate background checks and failure to properly investigate previous complaints. During the legal proceedings, 2 other women came forward with similar experiences involving Marcus's inappropriate behavior during their recovery periods. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my medical vulnerability was devastating. I had trusted Marcus with access to my home, my physical care, and my personal safety during one of the most helpless periods of my life. Learning that he had been documenting my vulnerability and photographing me without consent felt like a profound violation of the most basic human dignities. The case highlighted how medical professionals can exploit the trust and dependency that comes with home health care services. Patients recovering from surgery or managing chronic conditions are often isolated, medicated, and physically vulnerable, making them ideal targets for predators who use legitimate medical access to commit crimes. I had to complete my recovery with a different aid and additional security measures, but the experience left me with lasting anxiety about medical care and trusting healthcare workers in private settings. The violation of having someone exploit my physical helplessness and medical needs for predatory purposes created trust issues that affected my relationships with all healthcare providers. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison and banned from working in healthcare. but the agency's failure to properly screen and monitor their employees raised broader questions about patient safety in home care situations. The case became part of a larger investigation into inadequate oversight of home health care workers and the vulnerability of patients who require in-home medical assistance. Even now, 2 years later, I remain hypervigilant about healthcare workers and never allow anyone to provide medical care in my home without additional oversight. The experience taught me that medical credentials and professional references cannot guarantee that someone will not exploit the trust and vulnerability that comes with providing intimate healthcare services. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that my physical recovery had been secondary to Marcus's personal agenda. He had used my medical needs as cover for stalking, surveillance, and exploitation, turning what should have been a healing process into a prolonged period of victimization that extended my vulnerability far beyond my original injury. My name is River Bennett, and I live in Salem, Oregon, in a small house about 10 minutes from downtown. What happened to me during a winter storm last January taught me that natural disasters create opportunities for predators who know how to exploit chaos and confusion to target vulnerable people. I am 23 years old and work as a freelance web developer, which means I spend most of my time at home working on my computer. I live alone in a modest single-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood where most of my neighbors are elderly or families with young children. It is the kind of place where people know each other by name and look out for one another, especially during emergencies. On January 15th, a massive ice storm hit the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it winds that knocked down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. By 8 o'clock that evening, my entire neighborhood had lost electricity, and the temperature inside my house was dropping rapidly as the heating system shut down. I had prepared for the storm by stocking up on flashlights, batteries, candles, and non-perishable food, but I had not anticipated how isolating and vulnerable the complete loss of power would make me feel. My cell phone had limited battery life, and with no internet or landline service, I was effectively cut off from the outside world. Around 10 o'clock, I heard someone knocking on my front door. When I looked through the peephole with my flashlight, I saw a man in what appeared to be an official utility company uniform holding a clipboard and wearing a hard hat. He identified himself as a power company technician conducting door-to-door checks to assess damage and estimate repair times. The man seemed legitimate. He knew specific details about the storm, mentioned that several transformers in the area had been damaged, and explained that crews were working around the clock to restore power. He asked if I was experiencing any electrical hazards like downed lines near my house or unusual smells that might indicate gas leaks. His questions seemed reasonable, and I was grateful that the utility company was being so thorough about checking on residents during the emergency. When he asked if I lived alone and whether I had adequate heating sources to get through the night, I told him I was managing well with blankets and a small camping stove for heating food. The technician, who said his name was Frank, explained that the power outage was expected to last at least 2 more days due to the extent of the damage. He offered to check my electrical panel to make sure there were no safety issues that could cause problems when power was restored, and suggested I might want to stay with family or friends if I did not have adequate heating. I appreciated his concern and allowed him to examine the electrical panel in my basement. He spent about 10 minutes looking at the breaker box with his flashlight, making notes on his clipboard and explaining that everything looked safe. Before leaving, he gave me his business card and said crews would return the next day to continue assessments. After Frank left, I felt reassured that professionals were handling the emergency situation. But about an hour later, I heard someone trying to open my back door. When I investigated with my flashlight, I could see the door handle being turned from the outside, and someone was definitely attempting to enter my house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called out that I was armed and had already called the police. The attempted entry stopped immediately, but I could hear footsteps moving around the outside of my house. Someone was circling the property, testing windows and trying other potential entry points. My cell phone had very little battery remaining, but I managed to call 911 and report the attempted break-in. The dispatcher said multiple officers were responding to emergency calls throughout the city due to the storm, but someone would be sent to check on me as soon as possible. She advised me to remain inside and avoid confronting the intruder directly. While waiting for police, I heard the person continue to move around my house, testing windows and doors systematically. It became clear that whoever was outside was not randomly trying to break in, but was methodically checking every possible entry point as if they were familiar with standard residential security vulnerabilities. About 30 minutes later, I heard someone at my front door again, claiming to be Frank, returning to check on additional safety concerns. But this time his voice sounded different, and when I looked through the peephole, I could not see anyone in the darkness. The person was standing outside the range of my flashlight, which suggested they were deliberately trying to avoid being identified. I refused to open the door and told the person that police were on their way. Immediately, I heard rapid footsteps running away from the house, confirming that this was not a legitimate utility worker, but someone who was using the storm as cover for criminal activity. The police arrived about an hour later and conducted a thorough search of my property. They found evidence that someone had been attempting to pry open windows and had damaged the lock on my back door. Officer Martinez explained that power outages create ideal conditions for burglars who know that security systems are disabled and that residents are isolated and vulnerable. The business card that Frank had given me was fake. The utility company confirmed they were not conducting door-to-door checks and that all their crews were focused on repairing infrastructure, not individual assessments. The uniform and equipment he carried were easily purchased online and provided perfect cover for gaining access to homes during the emergency. Officer Martinez explained that criminals often monitor emergency services during natural disasters, listening to police scanners to identify areas where response times are delayed. They use official-looking uniforms and equipment to gain trust and access, then return later when they know residents are isolated and unable to call for help quickly. The investigation revealed that several homes in the area had been targeted during the storm using similar tactics. The perpetrator would pose as an emergency worker, utility technician, or relief volunteer to gain entry and assess homes for valuables and security weaknesses. He would then return later to commit burglaries when he knew residents were alone and cut off from communication. Police found the man 2 days later when power was restored and security cameras came back online. His name was Michael Torres, and he had an extensive criminal history of using natural disasters and emergencies to commit burglaries and home invasions. He specifically targeted areas where power outages disabled security systems and isolated residents from help. Torres had been monitoring emergency broadcasts and police communications to identify neighborhoods where power outages were expected to last multiple days. He would then pose as various types of emergency personnel to gain access to homes and gather information about residents, security systems, and valuable items that could be stolen later. The fake uniforms and equipment found in his possession were sophisticated and would have fooled most people during an emergency situation. He had uniforms for utility workers, emergency management personnel, and relief volunteers, along with clipboards, identification badges, and other props that made his impersonation convincing. During questioning, Torres admitted to targeting my house specifically because I had told him I lived alone and had valuable electronics for my work. He had planned to return after midnight when he knew I would be isolated and unable to call for help quickly due to limited cell phone battery and poor emergency response times during the storm. Torres was charged with attempted burglary, impersonating a public official, and criminal trespass. The investigation linked him to over 20 similar incidents across 3 states during various natural disasters over the past 2 years. He specifically targeted rural and suburban areas where residents were likely to trust official-looking personnel and where emergency response was delayed. The case highlighted how natural disasters create unique vulnerabilities that criminals actively exploit. The combination of disabled security systems, limited communication, delayed emergency response, and residents' increased willingness to trust people claiming to provide help creates ideal conditions for predatory behavior. I had to install battery backup systems for my security equipment and develop protocols for verifying the identity of anyone claiming to be emergency personnel. The experience taught me that criminals are often more organized and prepared for disasters than residents are, and they specifically plan to exploit the chaos and vulnerability that emergencies create. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my trust during a genuine emergency situation was particularly disturbing. Torres had used my natural desire to cooperate with authorities and accept help during a crisis to gather information that would have made me a victim of serious crimes later that night. Even now, I am suspicious of anyone who claims to be providing emergency services during disasters, and I always verify credentials through official channels before allowing anyone access to my home. The experience taught me that predators are often the best prepared people during emergencies because they have specifically planned to exploit the vulnerabilities that disasters create in normal security and communication systems. The storm that was supposed to bring my community together instead revealed how isolated and vulnerable we become when our normal safety networks fail, and how quickly criminals can exploit that vulnerability to target people who are just trying to survive difficult circumstances.